In 2008, in the flooded backwater of a river in Jackson County, Mississippi, the man running a spotlight off the front of a survey boat watched something come down off a sandbar and take one of his crew. He had spent half his life on that river and knew every animal in it by the shine of its eyes. What stood on the bank that night was not one of them. It had been pacing the boat for the better part of an hour, working the edge of the beam, holding back in the black water between the sweeps of the light where he could not quite catch it. The crew had floated the boat off the trailer in the parking lot because the ramp was 4 feet underwater. A storm had come up out of the Gulf the week before and sat over the basin, and the whole river was running high and out of its banks, and the high ground had shrunk down to a few sandbars and tree islands. That is where it had them. You have probably driven over a river like it a dozen times and never once thought about what use is the dark down there when the water comes up. By the time it was over, 4 men had gone up that slough and 3 came back. The one who did not come back was a 23-year-old seasonal hand. He was taken off a sandbar at close range, while the man with the light fought a drifting boat 30 feet away and could not reach him. They never recovered him. What the other 3 did to get off that bank, with the thing standing between them and the only dry ground in that whole black flood, is hard to believe even for the man who lived it. You are going to want to stay with this one all the way to the end. What follows is the survivor's account, in his own words. Real quick before we start, if true horror is your thing, hit subscribe and like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, let's begin. My name is Royce Easterling, and this happened to me back in 2008, on the lower end of a river down in Jackson County, Mississippi. I worked for the State Wildlife Agency, 14 years on the river crew by then. My job that summer, the part of it that matters here, was running the alligator surveys on the coastal rivers. You go out at full dark in a flat aluminum boat, you run a big handheld spotlight along the banks, and you count eye shine. A gator's eyes throw the light back at you, this flat red-orange color, and you can pick them out from a long way off. You count them, you estimate the size by how far apart the eyes are, you write it down, and every so often you catch one to measure it and put a tag in the web of its tail. Do that on the same stretches every year, and you start to know what the population is doing. It is slow, boring, careful work, and I liked it. I liked the river better at night than I did in the day. There were 4 of us out that week. I ran the boat and the light. Glenn Webb was the biologist, the one whose survey it actually was, and he sat in the middle with the clipboard until he handed it off. Lamar Pittman was the other tech, about my age, a guy I had worked 100 nights with. And then there was Caleb Tadlock. Caleb was 23, and he had been on seasonal with us since spring. He kept the data sheet most nights, because his handwriting was the only one of ours you could read. He had a boiled peanut habit that I have never seen matched by a human being. He brought a paper sack of them every single trip, and he ate them one-handed while he wrote, shells in his shirt pocket. Lamar gave him grief about it every time. Caleb was saving up to buy a piece of his uncle's interest in a shrimp boat over in Pascagoula. He talked about that boat the way other people talk about a girl. He was a good kid. I want to say that part now because of how the rest of it goes. The storm is what set the whole thing up, so let me back up to that. A system had come ashore down the Louisiana coast about 9 days before. Then it just stalled out and rained on the basin for the better part of 3 days. By the time the survey week came around, the river was 6 feet over normal stage and still coming up slow. Now, high water changes everything about a survey. The gators get pushed out of the open river into the backwater and the flooded timber, so you have to go in after them, up the sloughs and the cutoffs where they have gone to get out of the current. And the dry ground all but disappears. A bank that is 3 feet of mud in a normal August is underwater in a flood. The only places an animal can get up out of the water are the sandbars and the little hammocks. Those are the tree islands, the ones that sit a few feet higher than everything around them. I knew that water better than anybody on that boat, and that is something I have had a long time to sit with, because knowing it is exactly what put us where we ended up. We launched a little after 9. The ramp, like I said, was underwater, so we floated the boat off the trailer in the parking lot, basically, which should have been the first thing to tell me how high it really was. The first hour was normal. We ran up the main river, counting, and the numbers were low because the gators were back in the timber, which is what we expected. We caught one early, just to keep our hand in, a 6-footer up on a mud flat, and I want you to hold on to how we did it. Caleb noosed it off the bow, and Lamar and I brought it boatside. I took it right behind the skull with one hand, and Caleb took it by the base of the tail with the other. We lifted it between us into the bottom of the boat. We taped the jaws. We measured it. We put a tag in the web of its tail, and we let it go. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes. Neck in one hand, tail in the other. I did not think one thing about it. You never do. It is just how you carry a gator. Caleb kept the tally. Glenn marked the stretches on the map. Lamar worked the gas can and bailed when he had to, because the boat had a slow weep at the transom that we had been meaning to fix for a year. Ordinary stuff. I remember Caleb saying the peanuts were a little green this batch. Lamar said that was because Caleb bought them off a man working out of a cooler in a gas station lot. Caleb said that was the only place to get them. That was the kind of talk that filled up the first hour. Then we turned up the slough. It was a cutoff on the east bank, a long dead-end finger of water. In a dry year, it is mostly mud and lily pads, but in that flood, it was a road into the backwater, maybe a 1/4 mile of it before it shallowed out against the high ground. I made the call to run it. That is the truth of it, and I am not going to dress it up. Glenn asked which way, and I said the cutoff, because I knew there would be animals stacked up in there out of the current, and I wanted the count. Lamar said something about the water still coming up and us getting boxed if a tree came down across the mouth behind us. I told him we would be 20 minutes. I have thought about those 20 minutes more than I have thought about almost anything in my life. There was an old John boat snagged in the log jam at the mouth of the cutoff, half sunk, hung up in the drift against the bank. It had been there a long while. I ran the light over it going past, the way you do. And there was a tackle box still wedged under the front seat and a single rubber boot lying in the bottom of the hull. Lamar said it had been there since before either of us started on the river. We went on past it into the cutoff. The first thing I noticed in the slough was that there was nothing to count. That sounds like a small thing. It was not. In high water, that backwater should have been full of eyeshine, dozens of pairs. That is the whole reason you go in there. I ran the light up both banks and got nothing. No gators on the bank, none in the lilies, none up on the one sandbar I could see ahead of us on the right. I have run that light for 14 years, and I have never seen a piece of good gator water just empty like that. It was more than the eyes being gone. The frogs were gone too. That backwater in August should have been a wall of sound, frogs and bugs so loud you have to raise your voice to be heard. And it had gone quiet. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear the water moving along the side of the boat. I had never once heard that slough quiet in my life. I said it out loud. I said, "Where is everybody?" And Glenn said maybe the current was pushing them somewhere. And I said maybe. And I kept going, because the count was the job and the empty water was just strange, not scary. That is the part I want to be honest about. Strange did not stop me. Strange almost never does. A little ways on, Caleb said he smelled something. I had it too by then. It came across the water from the high ground ahead of us, and it was strong, and it was the worst smell I have ever had in my nose. Wet dog is the closest thing. Wet dog left in a hot truck, but under it there was something sweet and rotten, like a deer carcass a few days into August. And under that something sour I do not have a word for. Lamar said a gator must have a big kill cached up on the bar, a hog or a deer it had drowned and stuffed under a log, because they will do that, and it will rot and stink to high heaven. That made sense. Everything still made sense. We were a crew of people whose whole job was knowing what made the swamp smell and sound the way it did, and every single thing that was happening had a normal answer if you wanted one, and I wanted one. A gator survey catch works like this. When you want to measure an animal, you ease up on it. You get a snare pole over its neck, or you noose it. Once you have it boat side, you grab it right behind the skull with one hand, and you take the base of the tail with the other. That is how you control it, and that is how you lift it. Tail in one hand, neck in the other. 2 people on a big one. You tape the jaws with a roll of electrical tape, you measure. You tag the web of the tail, you let it go. We had done it 1,000 times. Caleb was good at it. He had quick hands. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. For about a minute in there, I was not scared at all. I had the light on the upstream end of that bar, and I figured we were finally about to do some real work. Ease up on the biggest gator of the night, sitting up on the sand on top of whatever it had killed. Caleb was already moving up to the bow with the snare pole. I was thinking it would be a clean catch and a good tag and something to talk about on the ride home. That is how close to a normal night it still was, right up until the light climbed the bank and found the eyes. We came up on the sandbar. It was the 3rd bar, not the 1st. I had it wrong in my head for years and made myself sort it out. The first 2 were small and underwater to the tops. The 3rd one was bigger, a long, low spit of sand with a stand of willow and a couple of big cypress at the upstream end. It was the only real dry ground in that whole slough, maybe 40 yards of it standing a few feet out of the flood. The smell was coming off of it. And when I ran the light along the upstream end, along the base of the cypress, that is when I saw the 2 eyes up in the air, copper-colored, wide apart, about 7 feet off the sand. I have spent a lot of nights since then trying to explain those eyes away, and I have never been able to. A deer's eyes shine, but they are not that color and not that far apart, and a deer does not stand and stare into a spotlight. A bear, we do not have many, but a bear's eyes are lower, and a bear runs from a light. These did not move, and they did not blink, and they were too high and too wide. The light was hitting hair below them, a lot of it, dark and matted and wet-looking. The shape under the eyes was wide, wider than a man, up at the top of the bar where the cypress was. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Caleb, real quiet, said, "That's not a gator." I cut the boat's drift with the trolling motor and held us off the bar maybe 40 feet, and I kept the light on it, and the eyes dropped. Not like it fell, like it lowered itself the way you would crouch. The eyes went down behind the willow, and the shape moved off to the side, and I lost it. Then I would catch a piece of it again farther down the bar, lower, moving with the light somehow, staying just at the edge of where the beam was strong. Every time I swept the light off it to find it again, it had closed a little. It was using the dark. I did not understand that in the moment. I understand it now. When the light was on it, it held still or it backed off. When the light came off it, it came toward us. It had figured out the light. That was the first time I was actually afraid, and it was a different kind of afraid than I knew about. It was not a startle. It came up slow from somewhere down in my stomach, because I was watching a thing be smart, and smart was not something I had a normal answer for. Glenn said, in this flat, careful voice, "Royce, ease us back." And I started to. And that is when the bank broke under Caleb. Caleb was where he was for a reason. When we came up on the bar, before any of us saw the eyes, Caleb had moved up to the bow with the snare pole. That is the normal spot. The light picks up an animal. The man on the bow gets ready to noose it. Caleb had done it on instinct, stepped up onto the casting deck at the front of the boat with the pole in his hand. This was before any of us understood what we were looking at. So when I held us 40 feet off and the thing started working down the bar, Caleb was already up front, already standing, already closest to it, with his weight forward. The boat had drifted a little while I was locked on the light. We were closer to the bar than I thought, maybe 15 feet off the downstream tip of the sand. and the front of the boat had swung in and grounded its nose, soft, on the very edge of the bar, in about a foot of water, and none of us felt it because we were all staring at the willow. Caleb stepped off the bow onto the sand. I do not think he decided to. I have gone over it and over it. I think his body did it, the way your body steps when you think the dock is closer than it is. The boat nudged the sand, his weight was forward, and he stepped. One foot, then the other, off the deck and onto the bar to get his footing. The second he was on the sand, the boat slid back off the bottom on the current. There was 8 feet of black water between him and us. It happened in about the time it takes to read that sentence. I yelled his name and jammed the trolling motor to bring us back in. But a trolling motor is slow, and the current had us, and it walked the boat sideways downstream, away from him. I had the spotlight in one hand and the motor in the other, and I could not do both right. The light swung off the bar and out over the water while I fought it. When I got the light back on the sand, Caleb was standing about 20 feet up the bar from the water, and the thing was coming down out of the willow at him. I am going to tell you what I saw the way I saw it, in pieces, because that is how it came. The light hit it side on as it came. It was on 2 legs, and then it was on all 4s for a couple of strides, and then up on 2 again, and it covered the ground between the cypress and Caleb faster than the distance should have allowed. I saw an arm, longer than it had any business being, swing out. I saw Caleb get a hand up. I saw the snare pole come up between them, this aluminum pole with a cable loop on the end, and Caleb shoved it at the thing the way you would fend off a dog. I heard the pole clatter, and I heard Caleb make a sound I am not going to try to describe. I drove the boat at the bar. I did not think about it. I came off the trolling motor, dropped the big outboard, turned the key, and ran us right up onto the downstream end of the sand. The boat slid up and stuck. I came over the gunwale into a foot of water with the spotlight still in my hand, because I did not have the sense to put it down. Lamar was yelling behind me. Glenn was on the radio, I found out after, trying to raise the county. But we were in a dead spot down in that river bottom, and the radio was nothing but static, and there was no cell signal. There never was down there. So it was just us. The thing had Caleb on the ground. I ran up the bar at it. I had the light on it the whole way, and I was screaming at it. Just noise, the kind of noise you make to a bear. It lifted its head and looked at me. The eyes came around into the light, and I got my one clear look at the face, and I am not going to be able to make you see it. There was something about it that was almost a person, and that was the worst part. The brow and the set of the eyes were almost a person, and the rest was not. The jaw was heavy and wide, and the whole face was pushed forward, and there was hair on it everywhere except right around the eyes and across the nose. It was wet. It smelled like the inside of a grave, and it was big. Up close, it was bigger than I had any frame for. It came up off of Caleb, and it stood up, and it was a head and shoulders over me, and I am 6'1". I got about 10 feet from it before it came at me, and this is the part where I got hurt. It closed the 10 feet in one motion. I tried to turn. It caught me with the side of its arm across my chest, and it was like getting hit by a swinging log. I went off my feet sideways and came down on a cypress knee, one of those hard-pointed roots that stick up out of the sand, and it caught me square in the right side of the ribs. I felt them go. It is a specific feeling, and I had never had it before, and I have never forgotten it. I could not get a breath. And as I went down and rolled, the thing came over me, and one of its hands raked down my back, across the right shoulder blade. It felt like 4 lines of fire. It tore my shirt and my skin in 4 long stripes, and then for whatever reason it did not press it. It went back to Caleb. I think, and I will never know, that I was not what it wanted. Caleb was what it wanted. I was just in the way for a second. I was on my hands and knees in the wet sand. The light was lying a few feet away, somehow still on, throwing a beam sideways across everything. I could not breathe right, and there was blood running down into my right eye from where my head had hit. I looked up, and I saw the thing take Caleb. I am only going to say this once, and I am going to say it plain, the way I would want it said if it was me. It reached down and took Caleb by the upper arm and the shoulder, one hand, and it lifted him off the sand the way you would lift a sack. His arm gave it the shoulder. I heard it, and I saw it. Caleb screamed, and then it brought its other hand around and struck him one time across the head, and the scream stopped. And then it had him by the back of the neck and the head, the whole back of his skull in one hand, holding him up off the ground, and Caleb was not moving. I crawled for the light. I do not know why. I think I wanted to take the light off it, like if I could not see it, then it would not be true. My ribs would not let me stand, and my right arm would not hold my weight. The shoulder and back on that side had gone wrong. I dragged myself through the sand toward the spotlight, and I got my hand on it, and I started to swing it away. And the beam came across the thing one more time before I turned it off. It had shifted its grip. It was holding Caleb by one ankle. One hand around his ankle, and Caleb hanging head down off of it. And the thing stood there at the top of the bar in my light, holding him up by the leg the way I had held 100 gators up by the tail. The exact same way. The body hanging the exact same way. And it was looking at me while it did it. It was looking right at me. And I understood something I have never been able to put into regular words. It knew what it was doing. It had seen this done on that river before, men lifting the animals up by the tail, year after year out there in the dark. And now it was doing it back to one of us. Then it turned and carried him up the bar toward the cypress, on two legs, holding him by the ankle. It went into the willow at the top of the high ground, and the willow closed, and I could not see it anymore. Lamar grabbed me under the arms from behind. He had come up the bar after me. He got his hands in my armpits and started dragging me backward toward the boat, and I was fighting him. I was trying to go after Caleb. Lamar put his mouth right against the side of my head and said, "He's gone, Royce. He's gone. We have to go." I could hear that he was crying while he said it, and I went slack and let him drag me. I could not get a full breath, and my right arm had quit on me, and the smell of the thing was still sitting in the back of my throat. The boat had slid up on the downstream tip of the bar in about a foot of water, grounded, with the current pushing on it. Glenn was already in it. He had gotten back in, and he was hauling on the rope at the bow, trying to break it loose off the sand. Lamar dumped me over the gunwale, and I came down in the bottom of the boat in 3 inches of bilge and bait water. I could not get up. My ribs were done. But I could see, and I could yell, and what I yelled was, "The current. Push it into the current." Because the slough had one thing going for it, the flood. The same high water that had shrunk the dry ground down to that sandbar was ripping down the main slough channel, maybe 25 feet off the downstream end of the bar. It was brown and fast, and 8 or 10 feet deep over what was normally mud. And the thing was a land animal. It was big, and it was fast on the ground, but it was a thing that lived on the ground. And the one place it was not going to follow us, the one barrier I had, was deep, fast water. I heard it come back out of the willow. I did not see it. I had the light off by then, but I heard it come down off the high ground. This heavy double sound, 2 feet at a time, fast. Lamar heard it too, and he stopped trying to be careful. He got into the water up to his waist at the stern and shoved. He put his whole body into the transom and shoved the boat off the bar, and Glenn hauled the bow rope. The boat came off the sand, grudging and slow, and started to swing. The thing hit the water at the upstream end of the bar. I heard it. A big, heavy splash, and then the sound of it driving through shallow water. That churning sound coming down the edge of the bar toward us in the foot-deep stuff along the sand. I rolled over in the bilge and got the light and turned it on and put it on the water behind us. And I saw it. Chest deep, wide as the boat, coming, throwing white water with every reach of its arms, maybe 30 feet back and closing, because we were barely moving. Lamar was still in the water. He had one leg over the gunwale and one still in the slough, kicking, and Glenn had him by the collar. The boat was turning broadside to the current and not catching it yet. And the thing was inside 20 feet. I could hear it breathing now, this huge wet bellows sound, over the motor noise, over everything. I got up onto my knees, and my whole right side screamed at me. I reached past Lamar with my good arm, and I grabbed the outboard and I cranked the throttle. The prop was half out of the water with the boat heeled over from Lamar's weight on the side, and it cavitated, screamed, bit nothing. For 1 second we did not move. The thing closed to maybe 12 feet, and I could see its arm come up out of the water, reaching for the back of the boat, for the motor, for Lamar's leg, I could not tell. Then the boat rocked level as Glenn hauled Lamar the rest of the way over the side. The prop bit clean, and the boat lunged forward. We came off the edge of the bar, and the bow swung out, and the nose of the boat dropped into the main slough current, and the river grabbed it. That is the moment. The current took the hull, and we shot downstream, and the motor was screaming. I held the throttle wide open with my good hand, and we pulled away from it. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, and I kept the light on it. It stopped at the edge of the deep water. It came to where the bar dropped off into the channel, chest deep, and it stood up to its full height in the current. The brown water was breaking around it the way it breaks around a piling, and it did not come into the channel after us. It stood there in the edge of my light, getting smaller as the river carried us down, and it watched us go. Then I lost it around the bend, and there was just the dark and the engine, and the three of us. And Caleb's empty paper sack of peanuts was rolling around in the bottom of the boat in the bilge water against my face. We ran that boat all the way back down to the main river and out, and we did not slow down. Glenn got a cell signal a mile down where the river opened up, and he called the sheriff's office in a voice I had never heard him use. I lay in the bottom of the boat the whole way with the wet clipboard against my chest. I had grabbed it without knowing I grabbed it, the way I grabbed the light, and I held on to it like it mattered. They had every kind of agency out there by first light. The sheriff, our own people, a team that came down from the state with dogs. The river was so high and so fast that the dogs could not do much, and the high ground was 3 little sandbars in a flooded backwater that you could not get a vehicle anywhere near. They found Caleb's snare pole on the 3rd bar, bent. They found tracks in the wet sand of that bar. And I will tell you, a deputy who had been hunting that country his whole life took one look at them. He got real quiet and would not say a word about them. The tracks were never in any report I ever saw. They found a place up at the top of the bar, back in the willow on the high ground, where things had been dragged and where the smell was. I am told there were old bones in there, deer and hog, and some that the men who looked did not want to talk about. I did not go up there, and I did not ask twice. They never found Caleb. The water came up another 2 feet that day and went over the whole bar and stayed up for a week, and after that there was nothing left to find. The official cause, the thing that got written down, was that a member of the survey crew was lost in high water after a fall from the boat. That is what the paper says. The state pulled the alligator survey off that river system that year and the year after for what they called access and safety reasons, because of the flooding. I never argued with the paper. There was no version of the truth I could have written down that anybody would have signed. A few things I never figured out. I never figured out where the gators went. That whole slough should have been full of them, and it was empty. I have come to think they cleared out the same way everything else with sense clears out of a place. They go when there is something in it that they know about and we do not. But that is just a thing I tell myself. I never found out who the man was that the old John boat at the mouth of the slough belonged to, the one we passed going in. One of our people said he went out one night a long time back and never came home, and the boat had hung in that log jam ever since. Glenn looked into it later and could not turn up a name, and I never figured out why it let me go. I have a piece of cypress root's worth of broken rib and 4 scars down my back. The doctors in town stitched them and asked me twice how I really got them. I never told them. and I do not know to this day why it spent that half second on me, and then went back to Caleb and left me on the sand. I think it could count. I think it knew the difference between 3 of us in a boat and 1 of us on the ground. But that is the kind of thing a man tells himself so he can sleep, and I have learned to leave it there. Lamar quit the agency that winter. Glenn retired 2 years early. I stayed on, but I never ran another spotlight survey. And when they asked me why, I told them my back would not take the boat anymore, which was true enough that nobody pushed it. I kept the clipboard. I do not know why I kept it. It dried out, warped, and the ink ran on most of the sheets, but the tally page from that night is still readable. The columns are in Caleb's neat handwriting, the little marks for every gator we counted on the main river before we turned up that cutoff. And at the bottom of the page, the last thing on it, he had started to write the count for the slough. He got as far as the downstroke of a single number before the boat touched the sand. There is one short pencil line that does not finish. He never got to write what came next. Neither did I for a long time. But I can write it now, so I did. On the morning of March 19, 2024, on a spruce bench above the West Fork drainage on Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska, a 58-year-old Forest Service silviculturist heard a 6'4" predator drag a federal wildlife biologist out of camp at 4:47 and fired 4 Mossberg slugs into wet duff to put the same thing off his forestry technician 22 feet from a cold fire ring. The biologist had stepped outside to check the tarp. A long humming moan went through the spruce trunks. One short scream, then nothing. You will not understand what they were in unless you have been there. The bench is 2.5 miles off the upper landing of an old logging road. There is no road in. Cell service ends 30 miles before the trailhead. The closest helicopter was on the Ketchikan ramp, weathered down, not coming. What the silviculturist saw in his streamlight after he fired was wet hide moving low between 2 cedar windfalls. Then nothing. The camp smelled of wet moss and old rust. The technician lived. The biologist was found at sunrise 80 yards downstream, fed on, stacked against a hemlock blowdown with 8 deer skulls, 2 no one could identify, and 1 weathered human skull. The wildlife troopers later judged it to be 30 years old. The predator was not killed. The predator was not caught. If you live on Prince of Wales, you have probably heard in passing what the older Heidelberg families have been calling this for a very long time. You have probably told yourself you do not believe them. The man who walked off that bench will tell you why you should. The account, told by the man who lived it, begins now. Before this story begins, if you're into chilling horror, take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good scare. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop it in the comments. Thank you for the support, it really does mean a lot. All right, let's get into it. My name is Royce Carrick, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in March of 2024 on Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska. I have been doing Forest Service groundwork in southeast Alaska since 2002, most of those years on this island. I am a silviculturist by training, which is a fancy word for a forester who plans what trees come out of a stand and what trees stay. In the Tongass these days, that mostly means second growth thinning. The old growth sales largely stopped after the rulemaking in 2023. What we work now is the regrown patches from cuts in the 60s and 70s, the ones that need spacing before any timber value can develop at all. I work out of the Thorn Bay Ranger District on the eastern side of the island. I live by myself in Klawak, in a small wood frame house I have been remodeling, room by room, since 2008. I tie salmon flies in the back room through the winter, and that is the only thing I do that has nothing to do with measuring trees. It is the thing that keeps me steady. I say all that because nothing in what comes after this is something I went looking for. The work order came in on a Friday afternoon from my district ranger, Mona Sigurdsson, Unit 12B at the head of the West Fork drainage off Forest Road 30. 3-day timber stand exam, The last one of the spring before the breakup, mud closed the upper roads for a month. Laney Corpella was the technician. 29, second season with the district, originally from Palmer, forestry degree out of northern Arizona. The third person on the trip was not agency. Petrus Olson was a wildlife biologist on detail to U.S. Fish and Wildlife out of Juneau, doing Queen Charlotte goshawk surveys on the island under a 2024 conservation assessment. He had asked Mona if he could ride along with a crew going into 12B because the unit margin overlapped an old goshawk territory he wanted to recheck. Mona told him yes. I told him yes. We had room in the truck and room under the tarp. I had worked one prior detail with him on a goshawk run out of Kaufman Cove in 2022 that had gone well. We flew the Beaver out of Ketchikan to Klawak on Sunday afternoon, March the 17th. Marnie Hovland was the pilot. Marnie has been flying floats in Southeast Alaska since the year I started with the agency. The airstrip at Klawak is gravel, and the wind that day was sideways out of the southeast. She put it down soft. We offloaded our packs and the case of slug ammunition and the long aluminum case with the Mossberg in it. I always check the Mossberg out of the gun safe at the bunkhouse on 3-day trips. We do not chase brown bears here on Prince of Wales the way they do up north. We have black bears and we have wolves, and on a wet March trip in the Muskeg country, I want a slug gun within reach of my sleeping bag. We picked up the district's Chevy Silverado at the airfield apron, where it had been left running by a maintenance kid named Harlan, whose last name I cannot remember. The truck is a 2018 with 140,000 miles and a heater that only works on the highest setting. We drove the 45 minutes from Klawak back up to Thorn Bay on the Big Salt Lake Road in steady rain. Laney was in the back with the field packs. Petrus was in the passenger seat going through a stack of goshawk call recordings on his phone and making me listen to 2 of them. One sounded like a kid arguing with his mother. The other sounded like a kid getting away with it. Petrus laughed every time he played them, which was often. He laughed easily. I want to make a point of that here. He had a kind of laugh that pulled you into it whether you wanted to be there or not, the way some people's laughs are. Laney was laughing too by the time we turned past the Black Bear gas station on the south end of Klawak. We slept Sunday night at the Thorn Bay bunkhouse, which is a 1982 double-wide on a gravel pad behind the district office. There is a wood stove in the front room, a kitchen with a coffee maker that takes 20 minutes to brew a pot, and a row of bunk rooms down a paneled hallway. I have stayed in that bunkhouse more nights of my life than in any single hotel anywhere. Laney took the bunk room at the back. Petrus took the room across from me. He stayed up late at the kitchen table going over his goshawk data on a laptop. I went to bed at 9:30 and read 15 pages of a paperback I had brought along and turned the light off. Monday morning, the 18th, was wet and dim. I drank a cup of bunkhouse coffee that tasted like a chewed pencil and watched the rain run sideways past the kitchen window. 41 degrees on the thermometer outside the bunkhouse door. We left Thorn Bay at 6:15 and turned off the main pavement onto Forest Road, 30, about 12 miles north of the village. The road climbs and crosses 2 passes and then drops into the West Fork drainage. The road is in fair shape for what it is. 2 big alder slides above the second creek crossing had been pushed clear in November by the district equipment operator. We made the upper landing in just under an hour, 23 road miles from town. The landing is a flat half-acre of crushed shot rock built up for a logging unit that closed out before Laney was born. From the landing, we hiked 2.5 miles in on an old skidder trail to the south side of the West Fork. The hike took us 2 hours. Laney had a 60-pound pack with the timber prism, the diameter tape, the increment borer, plot stakes, flagging, the data recorder, and a Pelican case of spare batteries. Petrus had a 50-pound pack with his goshawk broadcast unit, a Nikon with a long lens, his sleeping bag, and his own food. I had the Mossberg and 48 rounds of Federal Power Shock slug in a chest rig. My pack ran 65 pounds with the tarp, my sleeping bag, my dry bag of food, the Garmin InReach Mini clipped to the shoulder strap, and the camp axe. We arrived at the work site at 9:30. The bench is a 30-foot rise on the south bank above the creek, in a small natural clearing about 40 feet back from the water. The creek bends north into a muskeg flat about 150 yards downstream. The opposite bank rises hard into old-growth western hemlock and yellow cedar. The bench itself is the 76 cut, grown back into a dog-hair stand of 40-foot hemlock and Sitka spruce that is exactly what we were there to thin. There was already an old fire ring in the clearing, black charred rocks in a circle 6 feet across. Somebody had been there before. There was no way to know how long before. I had laid the unit out in 2011 and never used the clearing on any of my own visits. The unit has been on the books since '76 and crews come and go. I noted the fire ring and did not think much about it. I should have. We set up camp under the tarp. I strung the 12x12 between 4 spruce as a rainfly, and we put our 3 small tents under it. Mine was an MSR Hubba Hubba I have had since 2014. Laney's was a big Agnes copper spur, brand new the previous fall. Petra's had a Hilleberg Sulo he had bought himself, out of pocket. The fish and wildlife issue was the same MSR I was using, and he said he wanted something quieter in wind. I think about that detail more than I should. The Mossberg sat against the tarp pole next to my tent door. Safety on, chamber empty, magazine tube loaded. The rest of the box of slugs was in the dry bag beside it. The afternoon was wet and steady. 43 degrees on the little thermometer clipped to my pack. Laney and I ran 4 variable radius plots along the north edge of the bench, marking sample trees with blue ribbon and recording basal area and dominant heights. Petras took his Goshawk broadcast unit and walked 150 yards down the creek to the open margin near the muskeg. He played a recorded territorial call and sat through a 5-minute listening interval. He did this twice in the afternoon. He came back at 3:10 and told me he had gotten no response from the territory, which did not surprise him. The records on it were thin anyway, last documented in 2007. He was going to broadcast again at 4:30 when the light shifted. At 3:45 we heard the first wood knock. I was up at plot 4 with Laney, marking out trees. The sound was a single hard rap on a hollow trunk. Not a falling branch, not a woodpecker, not a deer cracking a stick under its hoof. The sound came from across the creek, somewhere up in the old growth on the north slope, maybe 200 yards out. We both stopped. Laney looked at me. I shrugged. We listened for maybe 40 seconds. Then there was a second knock, about the same volume, from a different direction. Behind us this time, up the bench in the dog hair regrowth, maybe 120 yards into the unit. We listened again. About a minute later, there was a third knock, this one straight downstream, near the muskeg flat where Petras had been broadcasting an hour earlier. I said it was probably wolves. We have Alexander Archipelago wolves in the West Fork drainage. They will smack branches against tree trunks sometimes when they are spread out hunting deer, or so I had been told by a state biologist named Verna Cobb maybe 10 years back. The wolves on this island have been protected and pressured by terns for 30 years, and they have habits I do not pretend to understand. Petras came up the bench at 4. He had heard the same 3 knocks. He said the timing did not match his broadcast call, which was a goshawk territorial vocalization that a wolf would not respond to in any way. He also said, in a quiet, slightly puzzled voice, that 3 wood knocks from 3 separated points at intervals of about 40 seconds did not match anything in his fieldwork experience either. He said it twice. Then he laughed and said, "But I am not a wolf guy." Laney was already laughing with him before he finished the sentence. I want to put a few things on the record about Petras before what comes next. He was 38, originally from Sitka, married, no kids. His wife taught at the University of Alaska Southeast in Juneau. He had been with U.S. Fish and Wildlife since 2009. He was a good man. We finished plots 5 and 6 before the light went. Petras did his 4:30 broadcast and listened for 5 minutes. Nothing came back. We were under the tarp shelter by 6. I made dinner on a Coleman dual-fuel stove I have owned since 1996. Mountain House beef stroganoff for me and Lainey. Chicken curry for Petrus. Lainey boiled water in a Stanley camp kettle for tea. The rain held off most of the evening, which I noted at the time as a small kindness. The clouds sat down on the ridge above us, and there was no wind on the bench. The smoke from the cook stove drifted straight up between the spruce trunks. Lainey said it looked like incense. We talked for about an hour after dinner. Petrus told a story about his father, who had run a charter fishing boat out of Pelican for 32 years and had taught him to gut a salmon at age 7. Lainey told a story about a professor at Northern Arizona who had bet her she could not climb a 100-foot ponderosa with spurs. I told a story about my district ranger from the early 2000s who had set fire to his own desk by accident and tried to pretend it was an exercise. Petrus laughed at all three. He was the kind of person who made you feel like your old jokes were new. At 8:15, Petrus asked me if I had ever seen anything strange in the Tongass in 22 years. I told him I had seen a wolverine on a deer carcass at Honker Divide once in 2009. Most biologists will tell you that is not supposed to happen because wolverines are not supposed to be on this island in the first place. I told him I had seen a black bear stand on its hind legs on a logging road in 2013. He walked that way for what felt like 200 yards before he dropped. I told him the only thing I had ever truly not understood was a run of dog camp deer bone piles up near Kaufman Cove in 2017. The troopers had ended up logging it in a file and walking away from it. I said it was probably wolves. I said the word wolves twice in one evening, and I noticed it the second time, and so did Lainey. She looked at me across the stove and did not say anything. We went to bed at 9:40. I woke once that night. The watch face on my wrist read 17 minutes past midnight when I checked. There was a sound coming from somewhere across the creek and up the slope. A long, modulated humming, low and wet. It sounded the way a strong wind sounds when it is blowing past the open end of a hollow steel pipe. It went on for about 90 seconds. Then it stopped. I lay there for another 10 minutes waiting to hear it again. I did not. I went through the possibilities. A deer cough is a single sharp bark, not a sustained tone. A wolf is wolf-shaped at any distance. Wind would need a thing to blow past, and there was no thing on that bench tall and hollow enough. A barred owl. We have barred owls in southeast Alaska. They are not native. They came in through British Columbia in the 90s, and they make a wide variety of sounds I cannot always identify. I settled on barred owl. I made myself go back to sleep on that. I was good at going back to sleep on explanations like that. I had been doing it for 22 years. I woke twice more in the night, once at 1:10 and once at 2:30, and heard nothing each time. By the third time, I told myself I was being a fool, and I slept through to 4:46. Tuesday morning, the 19th, I woke at 4:46 to the sound of Petrus unzipping his tent vestibule. That was the first thing that was wrong. Petrus was a heavy sleeper. He had stayed up past midnight at the bunkhouse Sunday night and had gone to bed Monday before either of us. I had not expected him out of his bag before 6:30. I heard him put his boots down on the wet duff and walk 3 steps toward the fire ring. I heard him say, in a low, ordinary voice, "What the hell is that smell?" There was a pause of maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Then I heard the long humming sound again. This time it was right outside camp, on the muskeg edge side of the bench, maybe 60 feet from my tent. It was much louder than the midnight sound. It was wet. It went on for about 7 seconds. I unzipped my own bag and reached for my streamlight and my Mossberg, in that order. My hands were not yet awake. I dropped the light once, getting it out of the side pocket of my pack, and had to feel for it on the tent floor. Then Petrus screamed. It was a short scream. He cut it off himself. The sound of him being moved through the wet duff started about a second after that. I heard his boots dragging through the moss. The dragging sound stopped at the muskeg edge, maybe 40 yards downstream of camp. I yelled Laney's name from inside my tent. I did not get out yet because I did not have my boots on, and I did not want my bare feet on the duff in the dark. I yelled her name again. She answered. Her voice came from her tent, 2.5 seconds behind mine, the way it sounds when somebody is pulled out of deep sleep. I told her to get her boots on and stay in her tent until I told her to come out. I got into my boots. I racked the slide to chamber a slug. I unzipped my tent and put the streamlight on. The cone of light fell on the fire ring first, which was undisturbed. Then it fell on the trampled wet duff where Petrus had been standing, and on a long dragging trail of moss and torn ground that ran straight downstream toward the muskeg edge. I followed the trail with the beam to the edge of the bench, where it dropped off into the flat. I did not see anything moving. Then I heard Laney scream. Her scream came from her tent, but it was not from inside her tent. The sound of her was being dragged through the duff, just like Petrus, and she was screaming her own name. I have thought about that a lot in the time since, and I have never been able to explain it. The tent itself was being pulled. I saw it move. The whole Big Agnes copper spur, with the rainfly still attached, was being dragged sideways through the moss toward the same muskeg edge Petrus had gone over. I put the streamlight on the tent. I saw nothing on top of it. I saw nothing behind it. I saw a shape lower than the tent, in the duff just past the foot end of the bag, gripping the foot pole through the fabric and pulling. The shape was dark gray and wet. It was low to the ground. I could not see the head. I could see the back, which was sleek and ridged like a wet seal but longer and narrower, and one shoulder, set high and forward of where a shoulder ought to be on anything I have ever measured against a tree. I fired the first slug at 22 feet, into the duff 3 feet to the left of the tent. The slug did not hit the shape, but the shape flinched hard. I worked the action. I fired the second slug closer. I worked the action. I fired the third slug into the moss directly behind the shape. The third slug was loud enough that the bench rang. The shape let go of the tent. The tent stopped moving. The shape moved sideways into the regrowth at a speed I could not follow with my eyes. I worked the action one more time and fired the fourth slug into the regrowth where I thought the shape had gone. I did not hit anything I could see. The hammer of the Mossberg sounded very loud in the gap between the shot and the next thing. The next thing was Laney screaming, "It's off me!" in a voice I had never heard her use. I went to her in 7 or 8 long steps. I cut the foot end of the tent fly with my buck knife and pulled her out by the hood of her sleeping bag. Her left arm was wrong at the shoulder. There was a long, shallow cut along the outside of her left hip that had soaked her bag through. She was conscious, and she was talking. She told me, in pieces, that something had grabbed the tent pole through the fabric and pulled. Her arm had gone first because she had grabbed the pole. Then her hip had caught on something hard inside the bag. I pulled her under the tarp shelter and laid her on the rolled-up bear bag rope. I put her down on her right side. I cut her base layer off the left shoulder with the buck knife. The shoulder was dislocated. The cut on the hip was about 6 inches long and about half an inch deep at the worst point. I put a pressure bandage from my trauma kit on the hip and used the chest strap off my pack to wrap it tight. I tied off a triangular bandage as a sling for her left arm and ran it under the opposite armpit. I did not try to reduce the shoulder. I am not a paramedic, and I have said exactly one shoulder in my life, and that one I broke worse than I started with. I unclipped the Garmin InReach Mini from my pack strap and held the SOS button for the full 5 seconds. The unit went green. I sent a follow-up text to the Iridium Gateway with the 7 words I had used twice in 22 years. Wildlife mauling, 2 injured, 1 missing. Immediate. The Iridium Gateway acknowledged 80 seconds later. I sat with Laney under the tarp with the Mossberg across my knees and the streamlight off because the battery was already drawn down and I needed it for later. It was 4:53 when I checked the time. The first gray of dawn was still an hour and a half away. The bench was completely quiet. Whatever had been there had gone. I could not hear it moving. I could not hear it breathing. Twice in the next hour, I thought I heard a wet huff somewhere across the creek. and twice I was wrong. I could only smell what it had left behind. It was a smell I have not been able to describe properly in any of the times I have tried, and the only honest word I have for it is rust. Wet moss, old rust, the burn of a campfire that had never been lit. We sat together under the tarp for an hour and a half. I did not leave her side. She drifted in and out. She asked me twice, in 2 different versions, whether Petrus was alive. I told her I did not know yet. I told her that twice and meant it both times. She asked me, the second time, whether she was going to be alive, and I told her yes, and I meant that too. The Garmin pinged a reply from Alaska Wildlife Troopers Dispatch at 5:52. They had Mona on the phone at the Thorn Bay District Office, and they were rolling a CRHC ambulance from Klawak to meet us at the landing on Forest Road 30. They said the closest helicopter, a Temsco out of Ketchikan, was on the ramp and weathered down. It would not be in the air until the ceiling lifted, and the forecast was not promising. They said walk her out if she could walk. I sent back that we could walk. At 6:25, in the first usable gray light, I told Lainey I was going to walk downstream and find Petrus. I gave her the Mossberg and I showed her the safety. She nodded. She had qualified on a 590 in a training course in 2022, and she remembered it. I told her I would be back inside 30 minutes whether I found him or not. I walked the drag trail. It ran from the foot of his tent down the duff for 40 yards, then went over the edge of the bench. From there, it traced a clean line through the moss of the Muskeg Flat for another 40 yards downstream, then bent east into a patch of old hemlock blowdown along the creek bank. The drag was about 18 inches wide, and the moss had been mashed flat under it. There were no clean prints. I have looked at a lot of tracks in my career. I did not find one print I could match against the photos in my field book. There were depressions in the duff at irregular intervals. They could have been the prints of a 4-pad pawed mammal. They could have been the heel marks of a man being dragged backward by his armpits. They could have been any number of other things. I made no determination at the time. The smell got worse as I walked the trail. It thickened the closer I got to the blowdown. Rust, wet moss, the burn of nothing. Then, 3 steps before I came around the trunk, it lifted off the air completely, the way a smell does when you step out of the room it was in. I found Petra's at 4 minutes past 8. He was stacked in the open against the seaward side of a downed hemlock about 80 feet up the bank from the creek. There were skulls around him. I counted them later because I could not count them then. 8 deer skulls. 2 skulls I did not recognize, that later turned out to be a young mountain goat and an adult goat. 1 human skull. The human skull was old. The skulls had been arranged with the eye sockets facing outward toward the open muskeg in a half circle around the body. I knew the second I saw it that this was an arrangement. Something had put each of those skulls there with intent. Petra's had been fed on. I am not going to describe how. He was lying on his right side, his head toward the creek, his hands curled in toward his chest. I have since been told that is a common posture for someone who dies of a single severed cervical injury. That is what the autopsy in Anchorage 4 weeks later determined had been the cause. I covered him with my own raincoat. It was a Helly Hansen anorak I had owned since 2019, and I left it on his body when I walked back up the drag trail to Lainey. We walked out to the truck. It took us 4 hours. Lainey could walk on her own legs, but slowly and not in a straight line. I took her pack, and I took mine. The Mossberg I carried slung muzzle down across my chest. We did not talk much on the walk. Once, about a mile in, Lainey stopped and threw up into the moss, and then sat for 10 minutes and then said, "Okay," and stood up. She is the kind of person I would want with me on any other field day. I do not think she will field again. She has not, as of this writing. At a little past noon, we reached the landing. The Silverado started on the first turn of the key. We drove the 23 miles of Forest Road 30 in just under an hour and a half. I drove slow because every jolt of the truck went straight into Lainey's hip. At the main road, I had cell service for the first time since Sunday. I called Mona. She told me the CARHC ambulance was waiting in Thorn Bay. I drove to it. They put Lainey on a stretcher in the parking lot of the Thorn Bay grocery and ran her north to the Alicia Roberts Medical Center in Clawach. The Alicia Roberts is the only clinic on Prince of Wales Island that can splint a dislocated shoulder and put 38 stitches in a hip. Anything more serious gets sent out on a float plane to Ketchikan. They did all that to her by 6 o'clock Tuesday evening. I stayed in Thorn Bay. I gave my statement to the Alaska Wildlife Trooper Sergeant from the Craig Detachment, a man named Jens Borchardt, who had driven across the island in his patrol Toyota Tacoma. I gave the same statement to Mona and again to Forest Service Law Enforcement Officer Don Pell. Pell had flown in from Ketchikan on the same beaver that brought the body recovery team. We went back up to the bench the next morning, Wednesday the 20th, with 5 people and 2 body bags and a Pelican case of camera equipment. We took Petras out by stretcher. We took the human skull out in a separate evidence bag. We bagged the deer and goat skulls as evidence of a sort I did not understand yet. There were small chips of bone in the moss under the windfall that we collected in a 4th bag, and that the Anchorage lab later identified as canid, probably wolf. Borchardt photographed the drag trail and the bone pile. He photographed the camp damage, which is what we ended up using in his report. There is one detail I should mention. The small tent Lainey had been in had 4 neat round holes punched through the rainfly along the foot panel. The holes had been put there from the outside. They were about 3/4 of an inch across each. They had been made by something with paired upper claws, or by something with one hooked claw used 4 times in the same panel. Borchardt's photographs of those 4 holes are in his file. Borchardt called me on Friday afternoon, the 22nd, and asked me to come down to the Craig Detachment office. Craig is on the western side of the island, about 7 road miles south of Clawach. I drove down in the afternoon. The detachment office is in a small steel building on the Harbor Road, next to the marine maintenance shop. Borchardt is a heavy-set man, 51 years old, with white in his beard, and a soft, slow voice I had heard him use in court 3 times in 12 years. He took me into his office and shut the door. There was a manila folder on his desk, about 2 inches thick. He opened it and turned it around so I could read it. The folder was labeled in faded ballpoint on the tab, Property Damage Wildlife Incidents West Carta. The first page was dated August of 1994. The last page was the property damage report I had filed Wednesday afternoon at the Thorn Bay District Office. It listed the destroyed tarp, the chewed-up Coleman stove, and the punctured Big Agnes copper spur. He let me read for about 10 minutes. There were 14 prior incidents in the folder. The earliest was a hunting party out of Ketchikan in '94, 3 men. They had a kill camp at Honker Divide pulled apart in the night. One of them was clawed across the back as he ran for the float plane at first light. The same hunter gave a statement under oath that he had seen the thing stand upright at the edge of his light beam, and that it had been 6'4" if it was an inch, with a shoulder set high and forward like nothing he had ever seen. The second was a logger camp at El Capitan Cave in 2003 that lost 2 dogs over 3 nights. On the 3rd morning, the lead faller had what he described as a big, lean, wet thing cross a yarder cable in front of him at first light. The third was a sea kayaker on the Carta River Wilderness in 2017 who found a bone pile against a hemlock blowdown on a portage. He reported it by satellite phone, was helicoptered out, and never wanted to talk to anybody about what had been on top of the pile. There were 11 more like those, scattered between 96 and 2022. They ranged from chewed camp gear at a remote bear viewing platform to 2 dogs taken off a Heidelberg subsistence boat tied at an anchorage near Suckwan Strait. Borchardt sat across from me and let me finish the file. Then he said the thing I had come to hear. The older men at the Heidelberg A&B Hall call it the tlachek, he said. He pronounced it tlachek, with the stress on the second syllable. There are different names for it in different families. The Klawok side has a different name I have not been able to get out of anybody in 3 years of asking. There is a paragraph in a 1922 Bureau of American Ethnology bulletin about a wet ground thing on this island that takes lone people. No one I have met has ever read all the way through it. He tapped the folder. My predecessor, a trooper named Ed Strickler, started this file in '94 because he could not get the Honker Divide case to close. He retired in 2010, and the file came to me. I do not believe it is a bear. I do not believe it is a wolverine. I believe it is a real predator that has been on this island longer than the spruce. What you and Petras and Laney ran into on Tuesday morning is the same thing that has been turning up in this folder for 30 years. He closed the folder. He told me he was not going to publish anything. He told me the file would stay in his desk because the file belonged in his desk. He had said the same thing to the 4 people before me who had read it. I asked him for Strickler's phone number. He had it on a Rolodex card he still kept on the corner of his desk. He wrote it on the back of a Craig Detachment business card and handed it to me. Strickler lives in Petersburg now. He is 78 years old. I have not called him. I think I may eventually. I thanked Borchert. I shook his hand. I drove home. Laney was discharged from the Alicia Roberts Clinic on Sunday the 24th. Her parents flew down from Palmer that weekend and took her back to her cabin in Hollis. They stayed with her for the week. Petras' wife came down from Juneau the following Tuesday, and we gave her what we could give her, which was not enough. I have not been back to Unit 12B. The thinning sail was reassigned in May to a contract crew out of Ketchikan, and I made sure they were warned. I did not tell them what they were being warned about. My right ear has not been the same since those 4 shots. The audiologist at Peace Health in Ketchikan called it acoustic trauma. I keep foam plugs in my chest rig now. The mossy bench is still on the books. In 2001, in the Fullerton Pine Flats of Vernon Parish, Louisiana, a Cherokee environmental contractor had his shoulder torn open by a canopy predator that dropped from a pine. The crew had gone in to mark pitcher plant seep lines and cavity trees before a prescribed burn. The first warning was a feral hog wedged high between 2 limbs with its ribs combed clean. The contractor stepped under that pine with 3 co-workers behind him, heard bark pop above his hard hat, and looked up too late. The thing hit hard enough to drive his knees into wet sand. It hooked through his vest strap and dragged him backward across their flagging line while the others fought to pull him free. You need to keep the order straight here because this one falls apart if you treat it like campfire talk. It bled on pine needles. It slipped in mud. It tore loose when a shovel caught its foreleg. Then it climbed for height again and shook old bones out of the crown. No one died there, but one man left with 47 stitches inside and out. His left hand took months to wake. Pink survey tape still makes him step back from ordinary trees. Before the crew got out, they forced the thing into a steel culvert gate with a baited pack. They dropped the locking bar and used the truck winch until the body stopped moving. The fear came from how ordinary each piece stayed while the day broke apart. Nothing about the work felt dramatic until the trees started answering back. The old name for it came from hunters around Pison Ridge, but that name was already waiting before the crew reached the road. What follows is his account. Before this story begins, if you're into chilling horror, take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good scare. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop it in the comments. Thank you for the support, it really does mean a lot. All right, let's get into it. My name is Micah Ratlingord, and this happened to me in 2001 in Vernon Parish, Louisiana, on the north edge of the Fullerton unit of Kisatchie National Forest. I was 32, Cherokee, and working that summer as the crew lead for a small environmental contractor out of Alexandria. The job was simple on paper. The Federal Land Office wanted a clean map of pitcher plant seeps and red cockaded woodpecker cavity trees before a controlled burn. A burn boss can handle flame. a burn boss cannot handle fire crossing the wrong line or taking a protected cavity tree. I had 3 people with me. Opal Billiot was a botanist who could name every grass in a ditch at 20 yards. Felix Demongo was a prescribed fire tech who had spent more days on a drip torch than in an office chair. Nadine Fontenot was 24, running the position receiver and keeping our lines honest. We were not armed except for tools. We had a fire rake, a fire axe, 2 shovels, a brush hook, flagging tape, handheld radios, and a first aid kit. The white work truck had an electric winch mounted on the front. I had one habit that Opal liked to tease me about. I kept a little pocket notebook for plant names, local names, and words I heard from older woodsmen. I was raised around Cherokee names for things, then spent my adult life learning the Gulf South names for the same kind of stubborn plants. That notebook had nothing to do with fear when the day began. It was just where I wrote things down so I would not sound foolish twice. By the end of that day, it held a pressed curl of pink tape. It also held a smear of dry sap from a tree I still see when I close my eyes. We left the district office on June 12th and turned off the hard road while the heat was still building. The air already had that wet June feel that makes every shirt feel used before work starts. Longleaf flatwoods do not look dangerous to people who have only seen them from a road. They look open. The trunks stand apart. The wiregrass sits low. The ground seems easy until you step wrong and sink ankle-deep into black seep mud under grass that looks dry. Fire keeps that country alive. Without flame, the yaupon and sweet gum move in. The pitcher plants lose light. The woodpeckers lose the old pines. The whole place turns into a different system. That was our reason for being there. We were there for work, and that plain fact mattered later. Fullerton had been a company town once, a sawmill place that rose fast, burned through timber, and left foundations, tram grades, and old roadbeds under the pine straw. Pieson Ridge lay west. Military training land pressed in from another side. The forest between them had that odd Louisiana feeling of being empty and watched by paperwork at the same time. You could walk 1 mile and cross 4 jurisdictions in your notebook without seeing a fence. In June, heat makes sound travel strangely. A truck on a clay road can seem close for a while and then be gone. That matters because we heard things that day and kept giving them human explanations. Engines, distant training, another crew, anything but weight moving above us. The first wrong thing was the flagging already in the trees. It was not our color. We used blaze orange for seep edges and blue for cavity tree buffers. This was pink, cheap plastic ribbon, tied high, not at eye level. Opal noticed it first on a pine that had an active woodpecker cavity about 26 feet up. Somebody had tied the ribbon around a limb at least 14 feet off the ground, and the tail end was shredded into thin curls. Felix said a squirrel hunter had probably done it, but he said it without conviction. The knot bothered me. It was a square knot, clean, tight. The ribbon above it was furred up where something had worried it with teeth or claws. Flagging tape is not decoration in fieldwork. It tells the next person where to step, what to avoid, what has been checked, and what still needs a line. Bad flagging can put a dozer into wet ground or send fire across a boundary it should not cross. High flagging is almost useless unless you are marking a hazard from a vehicle or warning somebody on horseback. We were on foot. Every strip we had tied sat at waist height or lower. That pink tape was above reach, and each piece had been pulled tight enough that the limb bark was bruised. The longer I looked at it, the less I liked Felix's squirrel hunter answer. We logged the tree and moved west along a shallow seep. Nadine called out grid numbers every 40 yards, and Opal corrected my plant calls when I got lazy. After a bit, Felix stopped and said he smelled a gut pile. That is common enough in hunting season. It is wrong in June. The smell came in short sheets with the breeze, sour meat, and ammonia under pine resin. We followed it because an unreported hog carcass near a burn line can draw vultures, coyotes, and headaches. I saw the shadow first, a dark oval in the fork of two limbs. Then the shape resolved into a feral hog, maybe 80 pounds dressed, wedged belly up 18 feet off the ground. Nobody talked for a few seconds. A hog does not climb. A bobcat cannot lift that much. A black bear can climb. Louisiana bears do not usually cache a hog that way. They do not comb ribs clean and leave the hide pulled back like a wet tarp. Felix kept looking around the base of the tree for boot sign, because his mind went where mine went. Somebody hoisted it. Somebody had a rope. Somebody was messing with the burn unit. Then Opal pointed to the bark. The pine had 4 fresh grooves running up the trunk in paired sets. They started about 3 feet from the ground and went all the way up, deep enough in places that sap had run and dried in amber beads. I did not call it a monster. I called it a bear because that let us keep moving. I took 3 photographs with a disposable camera, bagged a piece of hair caught in the bark, and marked the tree as a hazard. Nadine wrote, "Possible bear cache, suspend line," in the field book with a question mark. That question mark mattered later. Right then, I told her to keep the line going 200 more yards so we could close the polygon and get out. That decision sounds reckless only after you know the ending. In that moment, it was 4 workers, a strange carcass, and a map that needed finishing before summer storms built over the parish. The map packet had 1 page that bothered me before any of this started. It was an old cavity tree sheet photocopied so many times the numbers looked bruised. Somebody had circled 7 trees in pencil and written "verify from ground" across the top. That is common enough when storms knock out clusters or when a cavity goes inactive. Under one number, in smaller handwriting, there was a note I had taken for a smear. No high tape. I thought it meant a previous crew had flagged incorrectly. I never mentioned it, because there are 100 small oddities in old field paperwork, and 99 are harmless. That morning, the 100th one walked with us. The country changed as we moved. The open pine got wet underfoot. The pitcher plants came in dense red-green clumps. The smell of the hog stayed with us when it should have faded. We found bone under the next cavity tree. The bones did not look human. There were deer bones, hog bones, raccoon bones, and a few turtle shells split cleanly at the hinge. They lay in a crescent just outside the drip line. They were pale and dry on ground that should have stained them brown. Felix squatted with the shovel across his knees and said, "Micah, this ain't bear." Opal answered before I could. No bear is stacking shells by tree number. She meant the painted aluminum tags the land office nailed low on cavity pines. Every tree with a cache had a tag. We checked the numbered tags against the sheet. Tree 31 had a cache. Tree 34 had old bone. Tree 37 had pink tape. The pattern bent west, away from the seep line we were supposed to map and toward a slight rise where the longleaf stood older and wider. Opal said the plants were changing, less pitcher plant and more blue stem. That meant we were drifting out of our assigned unit. Nadine showed me the track on the receiver. Our line had a hook in it. I told myself we had followed the smell too far. Another explanation sat there waiting, and I did not want to say it. The caches were a route. There is a system to red-cockaded woodpecker work that outsiders do not see. A cavity tree has a number, a cluster, a buffer, a burn prescription, and a history in binders older than some seasonal employees. The birds use living longleaf pines. The sap around the cavity helps keep snakes away. People who work those trees learn to look up, because the important part of the work is usually above your head. Before long, I had looked up so many times my neck hurt. The pink tape kept appearing above us. It was never on the same side of the trunk. It made a broken line through the flatwoods, always just high enough to be wrong. Eventually, we reached a narrow fire break cut by an old logging tram bed. On the south side, the soil rose 2 feet and dried out. On the north side, It fell into a black seep full of pitcher plants and sundew. Nadine's main receiver lost lock under the denser pine crowns, so she opened the backup receiver and swore at both machines with real feeling. That was the first time any of us laughed. Felix took a strip of boudin from a plastic bag and offered it around. Opal told him if he dripped grease on her plant press, she would feed him to the pitcher plants. It was ordinary field talk. The mind will grab one normal piece of a bad day and hold it hard. Then something knocked twice above us. It was wood on wood, no bird call in it. Knock. Pause. Knock. Felix raised the shovel. Opal looked at me instead of the trees, which told me she had heard enough to stop pretending. Nadine said our radio had clicked at the same time, but I heard only the knocks. I keyed my handheld radio and called the district office. Static came back, then one broken syllable from the repeater. Nothing useful. The wet flatwoods were not mountains, but radio dead spots can still live in low country when heat, canopy, and distance line up wrong. I told everyone to pull back to the truck. Nobody argued. The path back was wrong. That was the part I did not understand until much later. We had set orange flags on the way in, low and obvious, every 25 yards where the seep edge bent. Now 3 of them were gone. In their place were strips of pink tape tied low, at hand height, leading east toward a thicker stand of young pine. Felix said, "Somebody is out here." I wanted that to be true so badly I accepted it for a heartbeat. Then a pine limb above the pink tape flexed down and rose back slow, without wind. It had weight on it. Something had crossed from one crown to the next. A compass settles an argument better than a scared man does. I took mine out and shot the bearing back toward the road. The needle gave me southwest. The pink tape line ran east-northeast. Our orange tape should have run in a clean, broken arc behind us. Instead, it appeared in one place, then vanished, then appeared 40 yards off bearing with the knot chewed open. Nadine found one of our orange strips balled under a root like a piece of gum. It had saliva on it. Felix said raccoon, and Opal said raccoons do not untie double wraps. Nobody answered her. We did not run. Running in that ground breaks ankles. I put Felix in front with the shovel, Nadine behind him with the receiver and radio, Opal behind Nadine, and I took the rear with the fire axe. That was the first good call I made all day. It may be the reason the others did not get hurt. The thing moved parallel to us for about 80 yards. We saw pieces of it, never all at once. A long forelimb folded over a branch. A narrow back passed behind needles. A tail or hind leg slid along bark. It stayed physical and clumsy enough to break twigs, but it used cover the way a bobcat uses grass. It was larger, and it understood angles better. The ladder back made noise. People forget that when they try to turn it into folklore. It made many small sounds, all easy to miss if you wanted to miss them. The scuff of claw on bark. A wet exhale when it shifted weight. A branch settling after a body left it. Once, it broke a cone loose, and the cone hit the ground 6 feet from Nadine's boot. She looked at the cone, then at me, and I saw the professional part of her shut down. Her face went flat. She quit wasting motion. A young tech had just learned that the job description had ended. The next stretch was about staying alive. Sometime after that, we found the second hog. This one had been dropped. It lay in the fire break with the skull broken open and flies already on the eyes. The body was warm enough that steam rose when Felix nudged it with the shovel blade. I saw pink ribbon tied around the back leg. That little strip scared me more than the carcass. It meant the tape was moving with meat. Nadine said, "It's marking food." Opal said, "Or it thinks we are." I told them to keep walking. My voice came out calm, and I remember being proud of that for a breath, which was stupid, but human. We crossed the fire break and entered the pines that bordered the culvert road. The truck was less than 500 yards away. I could hear cicadas, our boots, Felix breathing hard through his nose, the plastic tick of Nadine's receiver against her vest. I could also hear bark. It was gripping. A slow series of clicks moved above and behind us, and each click was followed by a fine rain of bark dust. I started calling it the ladderback in my head because of those paired scars and the way it used the trunks like rails. I did not say the name aloud. Names make things feel accepted. The attack came near the culvert gate. I know the place better than the time, because place is what pain leaves behind. We were 30 yards from the gate where the road crossed a drainage ditch. I had turned to check the rear when the ladderback fell out of a pine at an angle, not straight down. It had pushed off from the trunk and hit me shoulder first. The impact drove the air out of me and put my face into wet sand. A claw went through the left strap of my vest, through shirt, skin, and meat, and stopped somewhere near my shoulder blade. It hurt in a bright, mechanical way, like a hot nail being pried sideways. Felix swung the shovel and caught its foreleg. That saved me. The blade did not cut deep, but it turned the limb and the claw tore out instead of in. I still have the scar, a crooked trench from collarbone to back, with 2 small white pits where the points went deepest. Opal grabbed my belt. Nadine grabbed Opal. The thing pulled once, and all 3 of them slid in the mud with me. Then Felix hit it again, harder, across the same foreleg, and it let go with a coughing grunt that sounded too low for its narrow chest. It climbed, slipped halfway, caught itself, and left a smear of dark blood on the pine. That was the first full look I got. It was built low when it moved on all 4, about to my ribs. The body was long, with narrow hips and forelimbs heavier than the rear. Its hide had patchy gray-brown hair over tight skin. Raised ridges ran along the spine where old scars or bone plates lifted the fur. The head was wedge-shaped, with a blunt mouth and small, rounded ears pressed flat. The claws were the main thing. Curved, black, long enough to bite through bark, and set on hands that could fold around a pine trunk. It bled. It panted. It favored the shovel-struck leg when it climbed away. Opal packed my shoulder while Felix watched the trees. She used hemostatic gauze from the kit, a trauma pad, and her own bandana when the pad soaked through. I kept trying to stand, and she kept telling me I was not the supervisor of my blood. That was the second time we laughed, and the last. The wound was a rake, 4 channels torn through muscle, full of sand and bark. When I moved my left hand, my fingers tingled and then went weak. I knew enough field medicine to understand that I had a real problem, not a campfire story problem. Pain narrows the world in useful and useless ways. I remember each grain of sand stuck to my lips, and I do not remember Opal cutting my shirt open. I remember the smell of my own blood because it was warm and coppery under the ammonia stink, and I do not remember deciding to crawl. Felix said later I tried to apologize for bleeding on the map case. I believe him. People say strange practical things when the body is busy deciding whether to shut down. Opal kept 2 fingers in the wound while she packed it, and her face had no expression at all. That steadiness was not coldness, it was skill. The truck was visible through the pines, but the ladderback was between us and the straight route. It moved ahead, then above, then ahead again. It had learned our direction. The road culvert sat 50 yards to the right, a corrugated metal pipe under a raised dirt bed with a hinged steel trash gate on the upstream end. The gate kept flood debris from choking the ditch. It was open, held up by a locking bar. The work truck stood beyond it on the road shoulder. If we could reach the culvert, we had steel, chain, and the winch. If we sprinted across the open, it would hit the last person in line. With my shoulder bleeding, that person would be me. Felix saw the same thing. He said, "We make it come low." That was all. He had enough fireline sense to think in terrain. A creature that owned the trees had to be taken out of the trees. The ditch ran black and shallow under the road, not deep enough to hide in, but slick enough to make footing bad. Opal handed me the roll of orange tape, and I do not know why I took it, except that my right hand needed a task. Nadine had my day pack. There was a sandwich in it, Felix's boudin, sweat-soaked gloves, and my blood on the shoulder strap. That pack smelled like 4 kinds of bait. The culvert gate was old, but not weak. It had been welded from 1-inch flat bar with cross pieces close enough to catch branches, and the hinge pins were rusted, but thick. Normally, a maintenance man could lift it, swing the prop bar into place, clear debris, and drop it again. With the winch hooked low, it became a poor man's press. That was not the kind of trap anyone would design on purpose. It had too many ways to fail. The cable could snap, the hinge could tear out, the thing could back out before the angle closed. But every other choice put us back under the trees, and I had already learned what the trees meant. We backed toward the culvert with Felix swinging the shovel at every low branch. The ladderback came down twice and stopped both times when he squared up. It was not fearless. That mattered. It calculated. It wanted a safe angle, not a fair fight. At the ditch edge, Opal threw a handful of mud into the young pine where it had crouched. The thing flinched, exactly like flesh with eyes and nerves. Nadine saw that and started throwing pine cones. It sounds foolish until you remember we were trying to buy 5 feet at a time with whatever existed around us. By the time we reached the culvert gate, I could no longer lift my left arm. My shirt was stuck to my side. Felix ran to the truck, keeping low, and came back with the winch hook and 20 feet of cable. The plan formed in pieces. We clipped the cable to the gate's lower crossbar. Felix threaded it wrong the first time, cursed, fixed it, then tossed the hook back toward the truck. Nadine took the bait pack and added the bloody bandana. She had the hardest stomach among us. Then she crawled halfway into the culvert and wedged the pack behind a ridge in the metal. Opal held the gate up. I held the locking bar with my good hand. The ladderback watched from a slash pine 22 yards away. Its struck foreleg shook. Blood ran down the bark in short, dark lines. It clicked its claws against the trunk, not fast, just steady. That sound is what I hear when I smell hot pine tar even now. Felix got to the truck and started the engine. The winch motor whined once as he took slack, and the thing shifted higher in the tree. It did not like the machine noise. Then the smell from the pack came out of the culvert with the ditch air, and its head turned down. That was the opening. Nadine stepped away from the pipe. Opal moved with her. I stayed too long because I was watching the ladderback instead of my own feet. It dropped from the pine to the ditch bank, landed badly on the injured foreleg, and slid 3 feet in the mud. Physics saved us. It lost time because mud is mud. Felix yelled from the truck. I hauled the locking bar back. The gate was still open above my head, heavy enough that Opal had needed both hands to hold it. Now it wanted to fall. The ladderback lunged into the culvert mouth for the pack, shoulders narrowing as it entered the pipe. I dropped the bar. Felix kept the winch pulling. The work truck slid 6 inches in the sand before the tires caught. The gate bent. The ladderback shoved once more, and the pipe boomed with the force of it. Then Opal jammed the fire axe handle through the side bracket and leaned her whole weight on it. I could see its ribs moving. I could see the shovel wound in the foreleg. I could see our pack under its chin. It was flesh and panic and weight. It was an injured predator trapped in a piece of county steel, and it was trying to live. That made it worse. The winch killed it slowly enough that I still feel bad about it, and fast enough that I would do it again. The gate compressed the chest against the lower lip of the culvert while the bar pinned the spine. It fought for a short while. Felix did not let off. When the body stopped moving, none of us went near it. Nadine called the district office again, and this time the repeater caught 3 words: injured, culvert, Vernon. That was enough. We stayed in the road in open sun, with Felix between me and the ditch, until the first federal truck reached us. People ask whether officials covered it up. That is the wrong frame. Most official systems do not need a grand cover-up. They need a form with a narrow box. The deputy saw a wounded contractor, 3 rattled witnesses, a dead unknown carcass in a culvert, and no dead human being. The wildlife officer saw a diseased bear or exotic escapee until he saw the hands, then stopped saying much. The federal office saw liability, a burn unit, and a contractor injury. Later that day, the body was wrapped in a blue tarp, winched onto a trailer, and hauled toward a state freezer in Baton Rouge. I saw it loaded. There was a body. It did not walk away. I asked for the hairbag and bark sample before they took me to the ambulance, and the deputy looked at me like I was difficult for staying conscious. Nadine handed him the evidence bag anyway, with the date, time, tree number, and her initials written on blue painter's tape because we had no proper labels left. That sample never came back with a species name. Years later, somebody told Opal it had been contaminated mammal hair, which can mean anything from bad storage to nobody wanting to sign a weird report. The blood on the pine was photographed, the claw marks were photographed, and the carcass was real enough to need 4 men and a come-along to move it. The paperwork shrank all of that into one sentence. Before the tarp went over it, I saw enough for measurements. From blunt muzzle to hip, the carcass was a little over 6 feet. The tail added nearly 3 more, stiff and thick at the base, used like a counterweight. The front claws were each longer than my middle finger. The rear feet were smaller, almost delicate, made for bracing rather than chasing. A wildlife man with a clipboard said bear twice, then stopped after he counted 5 digits on the forefeet and saw the scar ridges along the back. Felix asked him where the ear tag was if it was an escaped exotic. The man did not answer. That silence told me more than a speech would have. At the regional hospital near Leesville, they cleaned my shoulder for a long time. They found bark under the skin. They put 47 stitches inside and out and told me I had been lucky because the claws had missed the subclavian artery by less than 2 inches. Lucky is a word doctors use when they mean you are alive and should not argue with vocabulary. My left hand did not work right for months. It still drops small things when I am tired. Opal came in with my field book sealed in a plastic bag. Felix came in with mud up to his knees and refused to sit. Nadine came in last carrying a printout from the district office computer. That printout is where the name came from. Nadine had called a cousin who hunted hogs around Pheasant Ridge in Fullerton, and he told her to look at an old thread on a Louisiana hunting board. The thread was dated August 19, 1998, and the title was Pink Tape in the Pine Tops. Most of it was jokes until a user named Old Bankston wrote about his grandfather. The old man had called the thing the Pheasant Rake because it came down out of pines and raked hogs open before taking them up. Another post said, "If you find meat over your head and ribbon where no man tied it, leave the block." A third post listed dates. The dates were why I kept the pages. June 9, 1912, a timber cruiser named Ephraim Trosclair disappeared north of the old Fullerton Mill Road. July 3, 1936, 2 hog hunters, Benoit Laborde and Armand Pichon, failed to come back from Pheasant Ridge after their dogs bayed under a pine, and then went silent. June 21, 1954, a 12-year-old boy named Curtis Saunier vanished while picking dewberries on the tram grade, and searchers found his red scarf tied 15 feet up in a tree. May 30, 1978, an Army private named Wesley Habbard went missing during an unauthorized night hunt. July 6, 1987, surveyor Orrin Delouche left a transit set up in the flats and was never found. The thread counted 15 people between 1912 and 1987. The thread also had tree numbers. That is what kept me from dismissing it as camp talk written by bored hunters. Old Bankston wrote, 31, 34, 37, and 42 are bad trees if the tape is high. And those were 4 of the numbers on our photocopied sheet. He wrote that the rake did not fear tape because tape had meant food to it for years. Hog dogs hung with survey ribbon. Wounded pigs got tied off by hunters. Timber crews left warning cloth high in danger trees, bright and moving in the wind. What men meant as caution, the thing had learned as invitation. That made the whole morning turn in my head. I do not know what happened to the carcass after Baton Rouge. I signed 2 statements. Opal signed 2. Felix gave 1 and would not give a second. Nadine copied the thread onto 3 floppy disks because she trusted paper and magnets more than agencies. The official injury report says I was attacked by an unidentified large mammal during field operations. That sentence is technically true. It is just small. The burn was postponed, then completed in December, and the unit greened up the next spring like fire country does. The cavity trees stayed marked. The pitcher plants came back. People love that part. They want nature to make sense because paperwork says it did. What I remember best is the tape. I remember tape before I remember the scream or the body under the blue tarp. Pink tape in the pine tops, pink tape on a hog leg, pink tape replacing our orange flags and leading us off the line. The forum thread said, loggers used to tie cloth high in danger trees after carcasses turned up, and younger men later tied ribbon there as a warning without knowing why. The ladderback had not invented the warning, it had learned it. It followed the color because color meant meat, noise, men looking up, men stepping under trees. That was the twist none of us liked. We thought the ribbon marked where it had been. The ribbon marked where it wanted us. The reason I still hate pink tape is that I watched a dead thing use it right. In November 2021, in the Quehana Wild area of north-central Pennsylvania, a bear research technician found one of his crew's steel culvert traps peeled open from the outside, with the drugged bear that had been locked inside it gone. The trap was a length of road culvert with a drop door, built to hold a 300-pound black bear that wakes up furious. Nothing on those ridges is supposed to be able to open one from the wrong side. The lock was still set. The door was still down. The steel above the door had been rolled back like the lid of a can, and there was bear hair caught in the bend, and no blood, and no bear. He was 4 days into a collaring survey with 2 other men, running a line of baited traps up an old logging grade, checking them in the same order every day. Catch the bear, put it under, fit a collar, turn it loose mad. By the 4th day, something in that laurel had been watching them do that work long enough to start doing it back. It killed what it caught and fed it back into the steel for later. Whatever walked those draws was not a bear, and it left a lot more than a bent trap behind it. It hunted the 3 of them through the brush, and before the week was out, there were men dead in the laurel, and men gone missing who would never be found. The last clear thing he saw out there was a hand coming in through a gap in steel, reaching for him in the dark. You are going to want to hear this one in his own words. What follows in his own voice is the account. Before this story begins, if you're into chilling horror, take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who'd appreciate a good scare. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop it in the comments. Thank you for the support, it really does mean a lot. All right, let's get into it. My name is Brett Updegrove, and what I'm about to lay out for you happened to me in 2021, up in the Quehana country where Clinton and Cameron County run together, in Pennsylvania. I want to start with the trap because that's where it started for me, even though Stan said later it had been working on us a day or 2 before that. We had 6 traps out along an old logging grade above Wyckoff Run, culvert traps basically. You take a 4-foot section of corrugated steel pipe, weld a frame on one end, hang a drop door, and bait the back of it with bakery waste and a little smelly stuff. A bear walks in, trips the trip plate, and the door comes down behind him. It's a livestock idea, more or less. You don't hurt the bear. You catch him, you put him under with a jab stick or a dart, you weigh him, You punch a tag in his ear, you fit a collar, and a couple hours later, he gets up and walks off mad at the world. We were 4 days into a 2-week run, contracted out by the state game agency to put collars on bears in that block before the firearms season opened, so the biologists could track how the bears moved once the woods filled up with hunters. There were 3 of us. Stan Marzek ran the crew. Stan was maybe 56, built like a fire plug, and he'd been doing bear work in that part of the state since before I was born. He didn't trust the satellite collars. He'd watched them fail on him for 20 years, and he kept a paper log because, in his words, the paper never told him a battery was full when it was dead. He called every bear we caught by some made-up name. There was a sister, a boss hog, a little dog-sized yearling he called Pretzel. He had a bad left knee from a fall off a rock years back, and on cold mornings he came up the grade slow, one hand on a hiking pole, swearing at it the whole way. I liked him a lot. The other guy was Cody Reichard. Cody was 31, and he was trying to turn the season into a thesis. He kept a waterproof notebook clipped inside his coat, and he wrote down every single bear we'd ever handled: the weight, the sex, the date, the trap, the works. He'd read the weights back out loud while he was driving, like box scores: 284, 191, 312. He was the kind of guy who got genuinely excited about a healthy sow, and he'd talk your ear off about acorn crops and den selection if you let him. I don't want to flatten either of them into a couple of sentences, but those are the things that come back to me first. So we'd run the line every day in the same order. Trap 1 was right where we parked the side-by-side, a little 2-seater with a dump bed that we used to haul bait and gear up the grade. Then the line ran north, 1 through 6, each trap maybe a quarter mile apart. The last 2 pushed up into a draw where the mountain laurel got so thick you couldn't see 10 feet off the trail. If you've never been in a Pennsylvania laurel hell, I don't know how to describe it to you except that it's a wall. The rhododendron and the mountain laurel grow up over your head in a tangle so dense the deer make tunnels through it, and you have to crawl those same tunnels or go around a half mile to get anywhere. We'd flagged the trail with tape so we wouldn't lose it. The whole draw smelled like wet ground and old leaves. The day the trap got opened, I went up ahead of Stan and Cody because Stan was slow on the knee, and Cody had stopped at Trap 2 to rebait. Trap 3 sat in a little clearing where a skid road crossed the grade. We'd caught a bear in it the afternoon before, a good boar Cody had logged at 298. We'd put him under, collared him, and we'd left him sleeping it off in the trap with the door propped, the way you do, so he could wake up and walk out on his own. That's standard. They come around, they shove the door, they leave. What I found was the door down, not propped. Down. And the lock set, which made no sense because we had left it propped open. And the top of the culvert, the steel right above the door, was peeled back. Not dented. Peeled like something had gotten its fingers under the lip and rolled it. The bear was gone. There was no blood. There was hair caught on the bent steel. The bear's hair. But no blood and no bear. And the only tracks in the soft dirt of the skid road were ours from the day before, and one set that wasn't ours. I'm going to be careful here about what I say I saw, because I've had 3 years to talk myself out of it. The print was long, longer than a man's foot, narrow at the heel, and the toes had dug in deep at the front like whatever made it had been carrying weight. I figured it for a bear at first, that's the honest truth. I stood there and told myself a big boar had come along, run our collared bear off, and somehow bent the trap getting at the bait. It didn't hold up even while I was thinking it. A bear doesn't peel steel like that. A bear doesn't set a lock. Stan came up behind me breathing hard, and he didn't say anything for a long minute. He looked at the steel, and he looked at the print, and he looked off into the laurel, and then he said something I've never forgotten. He said the lock being set bothered him more than the steel did. He said the steel was just strength. The lock was a decision. I should stop here and tell you where we were, because it matters for everything that comes after. The Quahana Wild Area is about 50,000 acres of state forest up on the plateau. big rolling ground cut by runs and choked with laurel. It is famous for two things, elk and bears, and there are about as many bears per square mile up there as anywhere in the state. That is the whole reason we were running collars before the season. But the thing about that country is that the laurel and the runs make a man on foot slow and half blind, and there is no cell signal anywhere in it. And once you are up a logging grade with the gate behind you, you are about as cut off from help as you can be in the eastern United States. We knew all that going in. We just thought the worst thing up there was the bears. We radioed it in. The station was down off the mountain, and the handheld would reach it from the high spots but not from the draws. And from Trap 3, we got the dispatcher faint and crackling. Stan reported the collared bear missing and the trap damaged, and asked them to flag it for the biologist. The dispatcher, a woman named Ruth I talked to every day that week, asked if we wanted a warden to come up, and Stan said not yet. He said, let me figure out what I'm looking at first. I've thought a lot about that too. Cody, when he got up to us, did the thing Cody did, which was get excited. To him, it was a puzzle, a dominance thing, something he could write up. He took 20 pictures of the bent steel. He measured the print with the tape from his notebook and wrote the number down and read it out loud. The way he read everything out loud, and the number was a lot bigger than it should have been, and I watched him stop being excited about halfway through saying it. We finished the line that day. Traps 4, 5, and 6 were empty and untouched, the bait still in them. We rebaited 3, set it fresh, and went down off the mountain. None of us slept great that night in the bunkhouse the state kept down by the highway. Stan stayed up at the table with his paper log and a flashlight, going back through the week. He'd written down weather and wind and what we caught, and he kept tapping one page. The day before the trap got opened, he'd noted that something had been at the bait in 5 and 6 and not tripped the door. Cody had figured raccoons. Stan had written, in his blocky handwriting, the word reaching. He showed it to me. He said whatever it was had reached into the back of the trap from the side, through the gap where the steel didn't quite meet the frame, and taken the bait without going in far enough to trip the plate. He said a bear doesn't do that. A bear goes in. He said this thing had figured out the trap. That is the part I want you to hold on to, not how it looked, how it thought. The next day was when it stopped being about bears. We went up the grade in the morning, the 3 of us in the side-by-side, and the first thing wrong was the trail tape. Up in the draw by 5 and 6, somebody had pulled our flagging tape down. Not all of it, some of it. Enough that the trail through the laurel didn't read the way it had, and if you weren't paying attention, you'd follow the wrong tunnel. Cody laughed it off, said a bear or the wind. But there is no wind in a laurel hell. That is the whole point of a laurel hell. And bears don't collect tape. I went quiet. Stan went quiet. We pushed up to 5. Trap 5 had a bear in it, a small one. The yearling Cody had named Pretzel weeks back, we knew the ear notch, and it was dead. It hadn't been eaten. It had been killed and pushed back into the trap, head first, part way, and the door brought down on it. So the body was half in and half out under the door, and the part of it that was out had been left alone. Cody got out of the side-by-side to look, and then he got back in. I had never seen Cody get back in. He didn't read the weight out loud. He didn't say anything. Stan said, quiet, that it had put the bear in the trap. He said it like he was making sure he'd said it, so it was real. And that's the thing I keep circling back to, even now. We were the ones who put bears in that trap. That was our whole job. Catch the thing, hold it, do what we needed to do, let it go. And something up in that draw had watched us do it for 4 days and then started doing it back. Killing a bear and stuffing it in our trap. Like it was keeping the bear for later. Like it had a larder, and our trap was a good box. We decided to pull the line. That was the right call, and I'll always be glad Stan made it. You don't keep running bait into a draw when something is doing that. We started back toward the side-by-side to drive out and get the warden up there and shut the whole study down for the block. And that's when we found the side-by-side wouldn't start. Stan was the one driving it. He turned the key and it cranked and didn't catch, and he popped the seat, and the fuel line had been pulled off the tank. Not cut. Pulled. The clamp still on it. The line lying there. I want to be clear that I don't have an explanation for that. A bear can flip a side-by-side. A bear can chew a seat. I have personally cleaned bear damage off vehicles. A bear does not reach under a seat and pull a fuel line off a barb and lay it down. We stood around that machine in the cold with the laurel wall on both sides of the grade, and I felt for the first time the specific feeling of being kept somewhere, of the door coming down on us. Here is where I have to be careful, because the next stretch is the part I have gone over the most, and I want to tell it the way it happened and not the way it has gotten in my head since. We were maybe 2 miles up the grade from the gate, and the gate was another mile of state road from anywhere. The handheld would not reach Ruth from down in that stretch. Stan tried anyway and got nothing but the hiss. Cody had a cell phone and there were no bars. There were never any bars up there. That's why we carried the radio. So we did the only thing there was to do, which was start walking out. Down the grade, toward the gate, the 3 of us together. Stan in the middle on his bad knee with the pole, me in front, Cody behind. We had not gone a 1/4 mile when we heard the first hunter. Let me back up and tell you about the hunters, because it matters, and because I only got the one conversation with them. The afternoon before, while we were finishing the line, 2 men had come down the grade toward us in blaze orange, both with rifles slung, bear hunters scouting for the firearms opener. One of them did the talking. His name was Lonnie France, and he had one of those faces that's all weather, and he was friendly in the careful way woodsmen are friendly with strangers. He said they were camped over the ridge off Mosquito Creek, him and his buddy Pat, and he asked what we were doing, and Cody told him. Collaring bears. Lonnie nodded slow, and then he said the thing I keep hearing in my head. He said they'd had something hitting their gut piles wrong. He'd shot a doe with his archery tag the week before and left the gut pile the way you do, and when he came back something had taken it, which is normal. Coyotes take gut piles, but he said this took the whole thing, dragged it off clean. And the next morning it had brought the deer's leg back and laid it by their tent. He said it like he was embarrassed to say it. He said Pat thought he was nuts. Pat Spangler kind of laughed and rolled his eyes, and they went on up the ridge, and that was the whole conversation. I told Lonnie to be careful. I don't know why I said it. He said you too. So when we heard the first hunter walking out down the grade, I knew right away it was one of them, because the sound was a man's voice up the ridge toward Mosquito Creek, and it was the kind of sound a man makes exactly once. You do not mistake it. Stan stopped. Cody stopped. The sound came again, shorter, and then it didn't come again, and the woods went into that flat quiet where even the little birds shut up. Stan made a decision I understood and hated. He said we go to it. He said there are 2 men up there, and somebody is hurt, and we are the only people for 4 miles. And he was right. That is what you do. So we went up off the grade toward Mosquito Creek, into the Laurel, following a deer tunnel. Stan slow on the knee and the rest of us slowing for him. And that is where the day came apart. We found Pat Spangler first, and I'm going to tell you what I saw the way I'd tell a trooper, flat, because if I dress it up, I won't get through it. He was in the Laurel about 60 yards off the grade. He was alive when we got to him, and he was not alive very long. The right side of him, from the shoulder down past the hip, had been opened. Not bitten in a spot. Opened, a long way, the way you'd open a bag, and the muscle of his back was laid bare, and one of the long bones of his arm was through the skin near the shoulder, and there was a flap of his scalp turned down over one ear. He'd been raked and dragged. The drag was plain in the leaves, a furrow 30 feet long where it had pulled him by the shoulder into the Laurel, and then, I think, lost interest, or got interrupted, because he'd been left. Cody got down and tried to hold the worst of it closed with his hands in his coat. Stan was on the radio yelling for Ruth and getting hiss. Pat was trying to talk and couldn't, and he died there in the leaves with Cody's hands on him in about the time it takes to tell it. His rifle was 10 feet away in the brush, never fired, the safety still on. I checked it later. The safety was still on. There was no sign of Lonnie. There was a second drag furrow, leading away, deeper into the laurel toward the creek, and we did not follow it, and I'll be honest with you, I have spent 3 years half ashamed and half grateful that we didn't follow it. We never found Lonnie France. The searchers found pieces of his gear in the spring, down along Mosquito Creek, but they never found him, and the report I eventually read listed him as a presumed fatality, missing, and that's all anybody can honestly say. So now there were 3 of us in the laurel with a man dead at our feet, and a vehicle that wouldn't start 2 miles behind us, and a thing somewhere close that we still had not seen, and the light was going. November in those mountains, the light goes early, and it goes fast. Stan said we get back to the grade and we get to the trucks at the gate. All of us, right now. We left Pat where he lay because there was nothing to be done and because the live matter more than the dead, and we started back toward the grade through the laurel tunnels. We didn't make it 30 yards before I knew it was on us. The wet ticking started off to our right, maybe 40 feet, moving when we moved and stopping when we stopped. The tunnels in a laurel hell run where the deer ran them, not where you want to go, so we couldn't just beeline for the grade. We had to take the bends the laurel gave us. Cody was behind me with a hand on my pack, and I had put Stan in front of me where I could see him, and his knee was slowing him to a shuffle. The ticking came around to the front of us, cutting the angle, and I understood it was trying to get between us and the open grade the same way it had gotten between the hunters and their rifles. We came to a fork in the tunnel. The wider branch went left, away from the grade, and the tight branch went right, toward it, and I made us take the tight one. We went on hands and knees through the rhododendron, and a dead branch caught Stan's coat and held him, and I had to back up and tear it loose, and that cost us. Because when we came out of that tunnel into a little gap in the laurel, the ticking was close. 20 feet. The sour barrel smell rolled over us thick, fermented, like the inside of a bait drum gone over, and I could hear it breathing. Cody made a sound, and I told him to keep moving and not look, and we crawled the last stretch hard, my hands bleeding on the woody stems, Stan grunting with every drag of the knee. The laurel thinned and went to brush, and then there was the gray light of the open grade ahead of us through the last of it. We came up out of the tunnel onto the grade on our feet, all 3 of us, and I had 1 second of thinking we'd made it. That's when it cut us off. I want to be precise about this, because it is the thing I am surest of, and the thing nobody believes. It did not come at us from hiding the way people want it to have. It had been with us the whole time. It had been working the edge of us, off in the wall of green where we couldn't follow, the same way it had worked the edge of the bait line for 4 days. And when the tunnel we were in came up against the open grade, it was standing in the gap, waiting for us to come out where it knew we had to come out. The light was bad, and I only saw it in pieces, and I am glad. It was tall when it came up off all 4s, taller than Stan, and it was thin in a way that was wrong, the ribs showing along the side in a hard washboard, and it was covered in a short, wet-looking coat the color of rust, of iron left out in the rain, dark red-brown and slicked down so the shape of the gaunt frame showed right through it. When it turned, there was a single darker stripe running the length of its spine. The eyes caught what light there was and threw it back a wet amber, and they were set forward on the front of the head, both facing us, the way a thing that hunts has its eyes, not the way a deer or a cow has them. One of its back legs dragged. There was a hitch in it, a limp, and I had time to think, stupidly, that we'd never get a collar on that, and then it moved. It went for Stan. Of the 3 of us, it went for the slow one, the one with the pole and the bad knee, and I understand now that it had been watching which of us moved slow the same way it had watched which trap we baited. It came across the grade low and fast, and the dragging leg did not slow it the way you would think, and it hit Stan and took him off his feet, Cody and I were both yelling, and Cody threw his pack at it, which did nothing, and I did the only thing my body knew how to do, which was reach for the jab stick. I had it on the side of my pack where it always rode. A 4-foot aluminum pole with the drug syringe seated in the end, loaded and capped, because we kept one loaded at all times in case we had to put a bear down fast in a trap. It was dosed for a bear. We dose by body weight. You estimate the mass and you draw the milligrams, and that loaded stick was drawn for a 300-pound bear, and the thing on top of Stan was bigger than that. So I knew, even as I pulled the cap with my teeth, that it was not enough. I knew it was not enough. I went anyway. I came down on the grade off balance. The heel of my boot skidded in the gravel, and I went onto one knee, and I got up, and I drove the jab stick two-handed into the side of it, into the meat behind the front leg where there was no rib, and I hit the plunger with the heel of my hand and emptied it. It came off Stan and came around on me. I felt the syringe snap off in it, and the pole come back light and empty in my hands. It got a forelimb across my back as it turned, and I want to tell you what that was, because it is the injury I still carry. It opened me from the top of my left shoulder blade down across the ribs. 4 long cuts, deep enough that I needed a lot of stitches, and deep enough that my left arm has never lifted all the way over my head since. One of the cuts ran up the back of my scalp, and that is where most of the blood came from, because a scalp bleeds like nothing else, and within a few seconds I had blood sheeting down the left side of my face and I couldn't see out of that eye. So now, I'm on the grade, half blind on one side, my left arm hanging, holding a broken pole. What it had done to Stan in those few seconds was past anything I could fix. It had opened his throat and the front of him in one rake. He was already gone, or close enough that what I want to believe is that he was gone. I grabbed him by his coat with my good arm anyway and pulled, and Cody got his other side, and Stan didn't come with us right. Cody looked at me and I looked at him, and we both knew, and we let him go on the grade and we ran. I have to live with that. The man's own rule, said an hour before over the hunter. The live matter more than the dead. And we used it on him. And then the drug started to land. Not all at once. It didn't drop. For a thing that size, what I'd given it was a stagger, not a sleep. But it staggered. The wet, amber eyes lost a little of their fix, and the dragging leg got worse, and it stood over Stan, swaying, trying to decide what its own legs were doing, and it made the wet ticking sound louder and turned its head like it had lost a thread. That was the window. Cody had me by the good arm, and we went down the grade away from it, me half blind, him hauling me along, and we got around the first bend before it came after us, and by then it was clumsy, and clumsy was all we had. Here's the part I think about most. We could not make the gate. It was a mile of grade and then a mile of road, and I was bleeding bad and going lightheaded, and Cody was not going to leave me. And behind us we could hear the dragging leg in the gravel, slow and then less slow, the drug fighting it and losing. And about 100 yards on, where the skid road crossed the grade, there was trap 3, the culvert trap, the one with the peeled lid, and Cody and I, without saying a word to each other, went to it. We crawled in, both of us, into a 4-foot steel pipe meant to hold one bear, and we pulled the drop door down behind us and through the lock. We sat in the dark in our own bear trap, the bent lid letting in a stripe of the last gray light, and we listened to it come. I want you to understand what I knew, crouched in there. I had spent 4 years of seasons putting bears in that box and watching them throw themselves against the door. I knew exactly how strong that box was. I knew it would hold a bear all night long. And the worst part, the part I would take back if I could take back anything, is that I knew this thing could open it. I had seen the lid. I had seen the lock it set on a trap from the outside, with nobody to help it. We were hiding inside the one thing in those woods I had proof it could open. It came up to the trap. We heard the dragging leg in the gravel and the wet ticking right up against the steel, and the sour smell came in through the bent lid so strong Cody gagged, and then a hand. I'm calling it a hand because that is what it was. Long, with the rust-red skin slicked over it, and it came in through the gap where the lid was peeled and felt around in the dark over us. It did not reach for me. I was on the low side, jammed against the back of the pipe with my torn arm under me. It found Cody. It got him by the collar and the shoulder, and it did to him what it had done to the bear in Trap 5. It pulled him toward the seam, up and back, and Cody got his hands on the door frame and on me, and he held on, and I held him with the one arm that worked, and I am telling you, I held him. And it was not enough, because the thing pulling on the other side had taken 300-pound bears out of that pipe. And I had one arm and half a man's strength and a head full of my own blood. The steel of the bent lid groaned and gave another inch. Cody went through the gap a piece at a time, and the last of him I had was his hand sliding out of mine. Then he was outside the trap, and the sound he made stopped, and I was alone in the dark in the pipe with the lock thrown on the inside, and nothing left to do but be quiet. I do not know how long that was. I have tried to put a number on it for the troopers and for myself, and I can't. The next clear thing I have is light. It was the warden. Ruth had never gotten Stan's calls clean, but she'd gotten the hiss, the same dead frequency keying over and over all afternoon. And she had done the right thing and sent a wildlife conservation officer up to the gate to find out why her crew had gone quiet. He came up the grade in his truck with the headlights on and the spotlight going, and the light came around the bend and washed over the trap. And for 1 second, it threw the thing's shadow huge across the laurel wall, because it was still out there, just past the trap, with Cody. The light and the engine and the man were too much for whatever the drug had left it. It went over the bank into the laurel toward the creek, and the last of it I have is the sound of the dragging leg in the brush, fading, the wet ticking going with it, and then nothing. And then the warden's boots on the gravel and his voice asking, was anybody alive in there? And me, in a voice I didn't recognize, telling him I was, and that I was the only one. They worked that draw for a week, the warden and the troopers and the searchers. They found Stan Marzek on the grade where we'd let him go. They found Pat Spangler in the laurel where Pat had died with Cody's hands on him, his rifle 10 feet off in the brush, never fired. The safety still on. I'd checked it. The safety was still on. They found the side-by-side with the fuel line pulled off the barb and laid down. They found Trap 5 with the dead yearling in it, and Trap 3 with my blood in it and the bent lid I keep telling you about. They never found Lonnie France. They found pieces of his gear in the spring down along Mosquito Creek, and they never found Cody Reichert at all. And the report I eventually got lists both of them as presumed fatalities, missing, and that is all anybody can honestly say. 4 men. I'm the one who walked out. The report called it a bear, a large, aberrant black bear. It said the fuel line was probably my crew's error, and the trap damage was consistent with an unusually large bear, and the 2 hunters and the 2 technicians had likely been attacked by the same animal. I understand why they wrote that. I'd write that too, if I were them, if I hadn't been in the trap. A bear is a thing you can put in a report. A bear is a thing that closes a case. The searchers recovered Cody's notebook in the spring with his gear, water-ruined but readable, every bear we ever handled in it, the weights, the dates, the box scores. The last bear in it is the yearling, Pretzel, with a date and the trap number, 5. And the line where the weight goes is blank. He never wrote a weight for the bear that thing killed and put back in our trap. I think he couldn't make himself estimate the mass of what had done it, and the number would have been a guess, and Cody did not guess. I kept the jab stick, the pole, with the broken-off end of the syringe still seated in it where it snapped off in the thing's side. The aluminum is bent, and there are 2 deep grooves in it where it got the stick in its mouth at some point and bit down, and the metal is pressed almost flat in the middle. I keep it on a shelf. People ask about it, and I tell them it's from my bear days, which is true, and I let them think a bear bent it, which is easier. And only the people in this story know that the thing that bent that pole had its eyes set on the front of its head, and put our bears in our own trap, and reached into the dark with a hand, and took Cody out of a cage I could not have opened myself. And that the only reason I walked out of there is that I'm good at my job, and my job was putting a thing that size to sleep, and I almost did. In January 2003, in a dead-end coulee out on the channeled scablands west of Odessa, Washington, a grain elevator operator and the 4 people he had brought in for a winter weekend ended up feeding a fire to keep something off them while it walked the rim above their camp. They had come in for the same cold weekend every year. Ice, sagebrush, a fire on the bank. Within 2 days, the only road out had drifted shut behind them, and a smell like old meat had settled down over the whole basin, and there was nothing alive in that country it could have come from. Whatever stood up on that rim was tall, far taller than a man, starved down to the bone, and it left long bare prints in the snow that came down 80 feet of sheer basalt nothing should have been able to climb. It did not move like anything he had trapped in 40 years out there. After the light was gone, it came down off the rock and reached one of them at the edge of the ice. By the time the others got across the frozen lake to her, she was torn open and bleeding into the snow. It was already backing off into the dark, its head turned to keep watching them. The truck would not climb the drifted grade. No call would carry out of that hole in the ground. There were 5 of them, one of them dying, and a whole Arctic night between them and first light, with nothing holding it back but a fire they were running low on wood to feed. You're going to want to hear this one, start to finish. The account, told by the man who lived it, begins now. Real quick before we start, if true horror is your thing, hit subscribe and like, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Okay, let's begin. My name is Wendell Kneep, and this happened to me back in 2003, out on the scablands west of Odessa, Washington. I ran the grain elevator in our town for the better part of 30 years, and the thing about that job nobody tells you is how dead the winter gets once the bins are full and the trucks quit coming. You go from 14-hour days in harvest to sitting in a heated office watching a moisture readout on grain that isn't going anywhere. So a long time back, me and a few people I trusted started taking one weekend in the deep part of January out to a coulee I knew, way off the county road, where there's a seep lake that freezes hard and flat as a tabletop. That year there were 5 of us. I'll tell you about them as we go, but the short version is this. Rennie and her husband Tobin, who I'd known for years. Gwen, who'd married into the area. And Gwen's brother Brody, down from the coast and dead certain there was nothing out here worth the gas to come see. We came in on a Friday. The road into that coulee isn't really a road. It's a 2-track that drops off the plateau down a steep grade, and at the bottom it runs out flat to the lake. My truck took it slow with the trailer behind it. I'd done it 100 times and never once thought twice. The first thing that was off, I didn't even clock as off. The lake was froze solid like always, but there were no birds. Out there in January, you usually get a few hard-luck geese, a handful of ducks sitting on whatever bit of open seep hasn't locked up yet. That day, there was nothing on the ice and nothing in the air. The whole sage flat was quiet in a way I told myself was just the cold, pushing everything down into cover. Animals do that. They hole up when it turns brutal. Brody asked me, half joking, if anything actually lived out here. I told him to give it a day. We set the camp on the north bank, where the basalt rim cuts the wind. 2 tents. A fire ring we'd built up over the years out of loose basalt. The firewood stacked under a tarp and weighted down with rock. Tobin got the fire going on the 3rd try, like always, and made coffee that tasted like he'd boiled a boot in it. And every one of us drank it anyway, because giving Tobin grief about his coffee is one of the load-bearing traditions of these trips. Rennie had worked the counter next to me at the co-op for 11 years, and was about the toughest person I ever met, man or woman, and she sat closest to the fire and called his coffee an act of aggression. The light went orange, then gray, then it was just the fire and more stars than Brody had ever seen in his life, and he finally shut up about how flat the country was. That first night was a good one. I want to be clear about that, with everything that came after. We sat on the bank with our backs to the rim and laughed about nothing in particular, and I remember thinking it was one of the better trips we'd done. Saturday is when it started. I'd hung the food the way I always did. The meat and the perishables zipped into a hard cooler, and the cooler set up on a flat shelf of rock about 30 yards back from camp, up off the ground, lid latched down. A coyote will work a cooler all night long if it's sitting on the dirt. When I went back for the bacon Saturday morning, the cooler was a good 15 feet from where I'd set it. The lid wasn't just open. It was wrenched clean off the hinges and lying in the snow a few feet away. And the meat was gone. All of it. Not scattered around, not chewed up and left in pieces the way a coyote leaves things. Gone, like somebody had reached in and lifted it out with two hands. That part I could almost explain. A bear maybe. Except there are no bears out on the Scablands. That's open sage and rock, not timber. The nearest bear country is a long way off. So I stood there working through it. Cougar, somebody's stray dog gone feral. A wolf way out of its range. And then I looked at the snow around the cooler, and every explanation I had just dried up in my mouth. There were tracks. They came in from the direction of the rim, and they went back toward the rim, and they were not paw prints. They were long and narrow and bare, like a man's foot, but too long for any man. The toes spread wide and dug in deep, and the space between one print and the next was wrong. Way too far apart for a person walking. I'm no tracker, not like some of the old-timers around here. But I've read enough sign in 40 years of walking that ground to know the difference between what a coyote leaves and what a man leaves. And this was neither one. I stood over those prints a good while. Then I scuffed the closest one out with my boot before anybody else came up, which is a thing about myself I still don't fully understand. Except that I think some part of me didn't want to say out loud yet what I was looking at, saying it would make it a thing. So I didn't say it. I told the group an animal got into the cooler, which was true enough as far as it went. We had plenty of other food in the truck. Cans, dry goods, enough to ride out a week if we had to. Tobin razzed me about my world-famous cooler skills. Gwen said she'd watched a coyote walk off with a whole pizza off a picnic table once, casual as you please, and we let it go at that. 5 of us, 1 truck, a fire, and a long way from the nearest porch light. And I let everybody keep believing the worst thing out here was a hungry coyote. I want to tell you about the cold, because the cold is a big part of this, and it's the part that's hardest to make sound real to anybody who wasn't standing in it. January out there is cold. That's the whole point. You go for the cold and the quiet. But by Saturday afternoon, it had gone past cold into something that didn't sit right with me. The fire would build up and throw real heat, and then 6 feet back from it, the air just ate the warmth, like standing in front of an open chest freezer with the lid up. The little thermometer Tobin kept clipped to his pack read way down, lower than the forecast had any business calling for, and it kept sinking all afternoon under a sky that stayed clear and dead still. There was no wind to explain it. That's what I couldn't get past, even then. Cold like that comes with wind. It comes with weather rolling in. This came down on a calm, clear afternoon and just kept dropping. The lake started talking too, these deep cracking booms rolling around under the ice as it tightened up. That part is normal. Lake ice does that. But it made Gwen jump every single time. And after a couple hours of it, I noticed it was making me jump too. Around the time the light started to go, Brody was down at the edge of the ice, skipping rocks across the frozen surface, the way you can't help doing when you're standing on a lake that's locked up solid. He stopped. He went quiet. Then he said, real flat, "Hey, Wendell, there's a guy up on the rim." I came down to the bank and looked where he was pointing. The rim of that coulee is maybe 80 feet of black basalt, broken into columns the way that rock breaks. And against the last gray light, there was a shape standing right at the top of it. Tall. Even from down on the ice, I could tell it was tall and thin and standing dead still, looking down at us. I cupped my hands and hollered up at it, the way you do. "Hey, you all right up there? This is a long way from anywhere." It didn't answer. It didn't move. We stood there a minute, all 5 of us by then, looking up at this still shape, and then the light dropped another notch, and it just wasn't there anymore. Not a turn. Not a walk-off that any of us caught. 1 second a shape, the next second bare rock. Rennie said it was probably a coyote hunter who'd come up on the rim to glass the flat for game, and we'd spooked him off. That made good sense. It's a normal thing for a man to be doing out here. I held on to that one hard. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, lying awake even now. To get from the top of that rim down to where its tracks had been that morning, by the cooler, a man would have had to climb down 80 feet of vertical basalt in the failing light, cross the open flat, and climb back up. No coyote hunter alive was doing that. And the snow the next morning proved that something had. We built the fire up big that night, and nobody said a whole lot. I caught myself watching the rim line over the tops of the flames. Tobin caught me doing it and didn't say anything, which told me he was watching it too. That was Saturday night, and Saturday night it came down off the rim for the first time. It didn't come all the way in. Not yet. We'd turned in late, after the fire had burned down. I never sleep worth a damn out there. And a little while after we'd zipped the tents up, I heard the snow. That deliberate crunch. Slow and heavy and spaced too far apart, working a slow circle around the camp out past the dead fire. I lay there with my heart going, telling myself coyote, telling myself deer, and knowing it was neither, because a deer doesn't circle a camp like it's reading it, and a coyote doesn't weigh what that thing weighed. The crunching went all the way around once. Then it went around again. Brody was awake in the other tent. I heard him whisper something to Gwen. Then the steps came in closer, right up to the edge of camp, and the cooler I'd set back on its rock got knocked flat with a crack that brought all of us up out of the bags at once. We came out with flashlights and the fire poker and the one gun in camp, and there was nothing in the beams. Just the cooler tipped over on its side. The firewood tarp dragged 10 feet off the stack, and that smell. The rot smell, hanging thick in the cold air right where something had been standing a second before. Brody had his light up at the rim and his hand was shaking so bad the beam was jumping all over the rock face. We threw wood on the coals and got the fire up, and the rest of that night the 4 of us sat around it with our backs to the flames while Rennie dozed against Tobin's shoulder. Twice more we heard it move out past the light. Patient, not in any hurry, just letting us know it was there. By the time the sky grayed up Sunday morning, it had gone quiet, and we'd half-talked ourselves back into the coyote story, because daylight does that to you. Daylight makes the night before feel like something you blew out of proportion. I should explain why we didn't just pack up and drive out Sunday, because that's the first question anybody asks me, and the honest answer is the weather beat us to it. Sometime Saturday night, the front the forecast had promised for Monday came in early, and came in harder than they'd called. No big storm. No howling whiteout. Just a steady fine snow on a rising wind. The kind that doesn't look like much through the tent door but moves a whole lot of country in a few hours. When I got up Sunday and walked out to look at the grade, the 2-track up out of the coulee had drifted in. Not impassable to the eye, but I know that grade. I've put a truck sideways on it in good dry conditions, hauling nothing at all. With fresh drift over old ice on a 12% pitch, my truck and a loaded trailer were not getting up it. Maybe with chains and 3 men digging and a full day of light. We had a few hours of light, 1 short-handled shovel, and not one of the others had ever dug a loaded rig up an iced grade in their life. There's no cell signal out there. Never has been. The scablands are a dead zone for 30 miles in any direction, so it wasn't like we were choosing not to call for help. There was nobody to call, and no bars to call them on. So I told everybody we were stuck for the day. Keep the fire up, take it easy, and we'd dig the grate out and get gone at first light Monday. Nobody fought me on it. That right there was the point where I should have understood how much trouble we were in, and I didn't, not all the way. Because in my head, the problem was still snow and a truck and a grade. Those are problems I know how to solve. Sunday is when the bottom dropped out. The smell came first, and it never left after that. I'd caught a whiff of it Saturday by the cooler and put it down to the lost meat going off somewhere out in the rocks. But Sunday afternoon, it settled down over the whole basin and it stayed. Thick and sweet and wrong, like a deer carcass that's been down in a ditch a week in July, except it was 5 below zero and nothing rots at 5 below. That's a thing I kept saying to myself, over and over, like it would help. Nothing rots in this. You cannot fake that smell and you cannot get used to it. Gwen got sick from it twice. We kept the fire roaring partly for the heat, and partly because the wood smoke cut the rot a little when the air shifted the right way. Tobin and Brody decided to walk the base of the rim before dark, to see if they could scout the grade from underneath, find a better line for the truck, or a spot we might winch off of. I didn't love them going. I should have said no. I didn't, and that's on me. They were gone maybe an hour. When they came back, Tobin's face had changed in a way I didn't like at all. He pulled me off away from the fire, away from the others, and told me they'd found something up in the rocks at the base of the rim. Tucked way back in a gap between two basalt columns, in a spot you'd never pick out from down on the flat. It was a sled, an old freight sled, the kind you'd drag behind a horse, the wood gone silver gray and split from sitting out in the weather longer than wood like that should ever last. The iron runners were rusted down to lace, and lashed onto it, half buried in old crusted drift, was a canvas pack so old the canvas had gone stiff as plywood, and a pair of work boots. The leather curled up hard as bone, set side by side on top of the load, like somebody had pulled that sled back in there to get out of the weather, sat down, taken their boots off for whatever reason a man takes his boots off in the cold, and then just never put them back on. Tobin said it looked like it had been sitting there 50, 60 years, maybe a lot longer than that, and it was a long way from any road or any trail, dragged back into the rock like whoever it was had been trying to get away from something. That's when I told them about the homesteaders. I hadn't wanted to because it sounds like exactly the kind of campfire story I don't traffic in. But they'd found that sled, and I figured I owed them what I knew. When the Germans came over from Russia and settled this wheat country, a lot of them, my own people included, the ground they got first was the good flat dirt up on the plateau. The coulees and the broken scab, nobody much wanted. Too rough to put a plow through. But a few families tried it in the lean years. Dryland claims down in the draws. Most of them starved out or gave up and moved into town. There was one family, though, that took a claim in a coulee out in this general country back in the 1930s, in the dust years. A man, his wife, and 3 kids. And one winter they just stopped coming in for supplies. When the neighbors finally rode out in the spring to check on them, the cabin was still standing, and the few head of stock were dead in the lean-to, and the family was gone. All 5 of them. No bodies, no graves, no note. Nothing taken from the cabin. The story the old people told was that something out in the scab had been at them all that winter. That the man had told a neighbor back in December they'd started burning the furniture for heat, because something kept the stock spooked and was walking the rim at night and taking the animals one at a time, and that he didn't believe it was a cougar. Nobody believed him. They figured he'd gone a little coulee crazy from the isolation. That happened to people out here. Then come spring, they were just gone. And every so often after that, going back decades, somebody would go missing out in this country in the dead of winter and never turn up. A sheep herder, a deer hunter, a surveyor running line, and the old people would go quiet and change the subject, and you learned not to push it. I'd heard that story my whole life and filed it where you file stories like that, standing there Sunday afternoon with the rot smell down in the back of my throat and a 60-year-old sled with some dead man's boots on it cached in the rock above our heads, I wasn't filing it anywhere anymore. We all agreed, every one of us, to keep the fire up all night, stay close together, dig the grate out at first light, and get gone. That was the plan. It was a good plan. We just didn't get the night we'd planned for. It came back after dark, and this time it came all the way in. We heard it before we saw it, and the sound it makes is the part that still gets into my sleep all these years later. It wasn't a roar. It was nothing like a bear or a cougar or any animal I've ever heard. It was a high, thin sound, almost like a man trying to whistle through a hurt throat, way up on the rim. Then it stopped. And then we heard the snow, that deliberate crunch of something heavy coming down off the basalt in the dark, down that steep, broken face where nothing that size had any business climbing down. It took its time about it. We got up around the fire, and Tobin grabbed the gun, an old pump shotgun he kept behind the truck seat, loaded with the light bird shot we'd never once planned on pointing at anything bigger than a goose. The smell rolled in ahead of it, thicker than it had been all day. Then it was out on the flat, just past where the firelight reached, and I got my first real look at it. And I'm going to tell it to you the way I saw it, even though I know exactly how it sounds. It was taller than the tent. When it straightened all the way up, it had to be 8 feet, and it was starved. I mean, the skin was pulled so tight over the bones you could count every rib and every knob down its spine. The skin had no color left in it. It was the gray of something that has been dead a long while and somehow kept walking. It hung on a frame that was all length, the arms too long, the hands hanging down past where its knees should have been. The face I only ever caught in pieces because it stayed back at the edge of the light and never came all the way into it. Deep-set eyes that took the firelight wrong and threw it back flat like wet stones. A mouth that didn't close, the lips dried back off teeth too long for the jaw to ever shut over them. And the cold came with it. You could feel the cold pour off it like a draft off a propped door. The fire actually guttered down low when it got close. The flames leaned away from it. I have no explanation for that, and I have given up looking for one. I just know it happened. I felt it on my face. It circled us. Just outside the light, right at the edge of where the fire reached, slow and patient, and we turned with it. 5 people turning in a tight knot, trying to keep it in front of us the whole time. Tobin had the shotgun up and tracking it. I'd grabbed a splitting axe off the woodpile. The other 3 had nothing but their hands. I kept my voice as level as I could and told everybody to put their backs to the fire and not run. Whatever else happened, do not run. Running was what it wanted. I was sure of that the way you're sure of things you can't prove. So we backed up toward the fire, and for a minute, maybe 2, it held off, just pacing that line. And I let myself think we might actually stand there with the fire at our backs until the sky came gray. Then it went for Rennie. It didn't come from where we were all watching it. It moved around the dark side of us, faster than anything that size has any right to move. And the first I knew of it was Rennie, making a sound I'd never heard her make in 11 years of standing next to her. Off to my left, at the edge of the ice, where the firelight died out. She'd backed up 1 step too far. Just 1. Out of the light. It had her by the arm, and it took her clean off her feet and started dragging her out onto the lake. And what happened next happened in about 4 seconds that stretched out into something a lot longer than 4 seconds. Tobin screamed her name and fired, and the birdshot did exactly what birdshot does to something that size, which is nothing that mattered. It flinched at the noise and the sting, and it kept its grip, and it kept dragging her. I ran out onto the ice after it with the axe, which was a stupid thing to do, and the only thing there was to do. I got close enough to swing. I hit it across the shoulder, a solid 2-handed hit, and I felt the axe bite in and catch on bone for half a second before I tore it back loose, and it dropped her, and it turned on me. It hit me with the back of one of those long arms, almost lazy about it, and I went down hard on the ice and slid a good way on my back with the wind knocked clean out of me. Then it was over me. I remember the smell of it up that close. I remember the cold pouring off it. And I remember that it was breathing, fast and shallow and wet. This awful, close, wet breathing. And I remember thinking very clearly and very calmly that I was about to die on a frozen lake 20 feet from my own fire. It raked down at me. I got my left arm up across my throat, and it opened that forearm right down to the bone. I could see the bone. The white hot of it hadn't even started to hurt yet. And the only thing in the world that mattered was that it had torn my arm and not my throat. That miss is the whole reason I'm sitting here telling you this. What saved all of us was Tobin and the fuel can. We had a 2-gallon steel can of camp fuel sitting by the woodpile for the lanterns. Tobin had dropped that useless shotgun and grabbed the can, and while the thing was crouched over me on the ice, he ran out toward us and threw the whole 2 gallons in a sheet, across the ice and across its legs and its back. Then he threw a burning brand from the fire underhand, right in behind it. And the one thing it had kept its careful distance from all weekend, the fire it would not come near, came up off that ice in a wall of flame. It came off me screaming. That same high, hurt throat sound, but enormous now, filling up the whole coulee. It went up in the flames and rolled and beat at itself with those long arms, and I'll tell you plainly, it bled and it burned. Where the axe had bitten into its shoulder, there was dark blood running down and freezing as it ran. Where the fire took hold, the gray skin blistered and split open. It was hurt, badly, and it knew that it was hurt, and that right there is the thing that got us off that ice alive, because for the first time all weekend, it was the one that was afraid. But the fuel was already gone, burning off the ice fast, with nothing under it to feed on. And here's where I had about 1 second to make a choice, and I'll be honest with you, I have second-guessed it 10,000 times since. Rennie was down on the ice about 15 feet from me, not moving much, the snow going dark and wet around her arm and her shoulder. The fire on the ice was already dying back down. I could grab Rennie and run for the truck right then, and pray the thing stayed down long enough to let us. Or I could buy us the 1 minute we actually needed and feed the fire everything we had left in the world. I screamed at Brody and Gwen to drag the whole woodpile out, the tarp, the tents, anything that would catch, out onto the ice between us and it, and light all of it. And I went for Rennie. We built a wall of fire clear across that lake out of our entire camp. Every stick of split wood, the tarp, both tents, Tobin's pack, the cardboard food box, a folding chair. And it worked. The thing would not cross a line of fire. It paced to the far side of that burning wall with the cold rolling off it, and the firelight jumping flat in those eyes, and it made that sound over and over, and it did not come through. And while it paced and screamed on the far side of the flames, I got my belt off and cinched it down around Rennie's arm above the worst of the wounds and hauled it tight. Tobin and Brody got under her arms and lifted her up between them. The 4 of us went off the back of the ice toward the truck with the whole camp burning behind us and that thing on the other side of it. Tobin snatched that useless shotgun up off the snow on the way, I think, just to have something in his hands. We did not get up the grade that night. The truck still would not climb it, and I was not about to try that pitch in the dark with Rennie bleeding the way she was, and a good chance one of us ended up under the trailer for the trouble. So we did the only thing there was left to do. We got Rennie into the cab and ran the engine for the heater, and we kept the belt cinched and her arm up over her heart, and the 4 of us packed in tight around her to put our own body heat into her. Because she'd gone gray and shaking, and I knew enough to know the cold and the blood loss together would kill her a lot quicker than the cuts alone would. And we watched the last of our camp burn down to coals out on the ice, and we watched the dark past the coals, and we waited. It stayed out there a long time. We could hear it moving, the snow crunching under it, working back and forth along the far bank in the dark, never quite giving it up. Once, somewhere down in the deepest part of that night, it came close. close enough that we heard it breathing right outside the truck. That wet, close breathing. And the cold came through the doors of that cab like the steel, and the glass weren't even there, fogging up our breath inside the truck. Gwen had one hand clamped over Brody's mouth and her own eyes shut tight. Tobin had that dead shotgun gripped in both fists like a club, and I had my one good hand flat on the door lock, for whatever a lock was worth against a thing like that. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound. And after a while, I don't know how long, that breathing moved off, and the steps moved back toward the rim. Then, sometime before the sky started to gray in the east, it just stopped. The cold lifted off all of us at once. The smell thinned out and faded and was gone. And we did not trust that for 1 second. We sat jammed in that cold cab without moving a muscle until there was real light coming over the rim, and we could see the whole flat and see that there was nothing standing on it. In the morning, the snow out on the flat was printed all over with those long, bare tracks, dozens and dozens of them. A path worn deep between the rim and the lake. The blood where the axe had bit it had frozen black in the snow. A trail of it leading back across the flat to the base of the rim and into the rocks, and stopping there. The sled was still up in its gap, boots and all. The thing itself was gone. The grade had set up hard in the cold overnight, hard enough that with the chains on and all 4 of us digging and putting our shoulders to the truck, we got it up that pitch a little after the middle of the day. And we drove Rennie the 50 miles to the hospital in town, with Tobin in the back seat holding that belt the whole way. She lived. Her arm took 3 surgeries and she lost a lot of the use of it, and she's got scars on it the doctors wrote down as an animal attack because there wasn't any other box on the form for them to check. She never once argued with them about it. The one thing she did, the whole long drive in, hurt as bad as she was and drifting in and out of it, she kept her good hand closed tight around the truck's spare key down in her coat pocket and would not let go of it. When I finally asked her about it weeks later, she said she'd needed to be holding on to one thing that was just a thing. That was ours. That still made plain sense, in a world where the other thing was real too. I think about that a lot more than I think about the rest of it. I went back out there one time, that spring with Tobin, to haul the trailer out. The fire ring was a black scar burned into the bank. The sled was still in the rocks, and we left it where it was. As we finished loading the trailer, I walked over to where the cooler had sat that first morning. The winter prints were long gone with the snow. But there in the dried mud, baked hard by then, was one track. Toes spread, pointed at the lake. In March 1996, in a box-end hollow below the rim of the Garden of the Gods in southern Illinois, a federal trail rehab hand and 6 others were herded toward the dead end by something that called like a wet cough. They had gone there to rebuild a washed-out crib wall before a cold front crossed the river that night. They were a mile from the truck and a quarter mile below the rim trail. A handheld radio could not raise the district office down there, and no cell phone in 1996 was going to help anybody. The first thing that was wrong was the deer. There were none. Not a track, not a flag of a tail, nothing. In a woods that should have been full of them. Then there was the sound. A low coughing call crossed from one wall of the hollow to the other. Then it answered itself from a third place, a place they had already looked at and seen nothing in. There were tracks in the creek mud. 5 toes, broader than a spread hand, a deep drag mark dug in behind each one. There was a greasy dark smear left waist-high on a boulder. They told each other a bear had leaned there, because a bear was a thing you could say out loud. Before the light was gone, one of the crew was caught out in the open and hurt bad. And high up in the sandstone over their heads, gray and rotted with the laces still tied, was a single hiking boot that no one had ever filed a report on. You are going to want to hear this one all the way through. The account, told by the one who lived it, begins now. Before the story starts, one small ask. If these keep you up at night in the best way, subscribe, drop a like, and send it to a fellow horror fan. And tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Thanks for being here. Now, let's get into it. My name's Travis Frawley, and this all happened to me back in 1996, down in the Shawnee National Forest in the far south of Illinois, in a place the maps don't bother to name. I was 24 that spring, and it was my first full season on a trail rehab crew. The Garden of the Gods is the most visited spot in that whole forest. Hundreds of thousands of people a year come to walk the flagstone loop out to the big sandstone formations and take their pictures. After a hard freeze and thaw winter, the trails come apart. Water gets under the stone, the ground heaves, the tread slumps, the little rock check dams blow out. Our job that March was to put it back together before the spring crowds and the spring rains. We had spent the morning up top, resetting flagstone on the main loop, and that part was easy. Public work, sun on us, people walking by. The afternoon was the part nobody wanted. There was a back hollow below the rim where a winter storm had torn out a crib wall and dropped a whole section of an old closed trail. The slump sat right at the foot of the head wall, at the dead end of the hollow, under the rock. Somebody had decided it had to be fixed before the front came through that night and made it worse. So we dropped in. You go down into one of those hollows and the temperature drops with you. The walls are sandstone, undercut and dark with seep. The floor is oak and hickory, and a creek that runs cold and clear and not very deep until it rains. We carried the heavy stuff down on our backs. Mattocks, a long rock bar, a couple of come-alongs, and Dell's saw and his gas. We dragged the staged flagstone and the cut rock down too, all of it, and we piled it at the bottom by the slump in under the head wall. That pile is going to matter later, so hang on to it. We staged everything at the dead end of the hollow, because that is where the broken wall was. That was when I saw the first thing I couldn't explain, and like everybody does, I explained it anyway. There were tracks in the creek mud, not deer, not the little neat split-heart deer track you see 10,000 of down there. These were broad and splayed, 5 toes, bigger across than my spread hand, and behind each one a drag mark where something heavy had pushed off. And on a low boulder, right where we set the gear, there was a smear. Dark, greasy, about waist high, like something had leaned its side against the rock and rubbed. Dell put his hand on it before he thought, then wiped it on his jeans and made a face. Dell Stennett was our sawyer, dry as a stick, 15 years on the forest. He looked at his fingers and said a bear had been using our work site for a napkin. We all laughed. There are black bears that wander through that country once in a blue moon, strays that drift over from across the river. Nobody had heard of one down there in years, but it was the nearest reasonable thing, and the nearest reasonable thing is what people reach for. So a bear is what we decided it was. I want to say it was around 1 in the afternoon when we found that smear. I never checked. Doyle Brandt was our foreman. He was the kind of person who would rather finish a job a day early than leave it half done and have to think about it overnight. That is a good trait in a foreman, right up until the one time it isn't. He looked at the sky, which had gone the flat gray it gets before a real rain, and he looked at the slump, and he made the call. We would get the crib wall built before dark and hike out the upper trail, instead of pulling everybody out and coming back the next day to a worse mess. It was a completely reasonable thing to decide. I would have decided it too. Nobody on that crew thought twice about it. There were 7 of us, like I said, Doyle and Dell, and then Marley Quist and Sheena Vogel and Errol Tackett, who were all seasonal like me, and Janelle Hartwig. I want to tell you about Janelle, because she's the reason I still can't walk a flagstone trail without my stomach going funny. Janelle had been a competitive whitewater kayaker before she blew out a shoulder. She'd taken the trail job because it kept her outside and near rivers, and she could read moving water better than anybody I have ever met. When the rest of us were arguing about whether the creek would come up that night, she just crouched at the edge and watched the water for a minute. Then she told us flat that it would be over the crossing rock by dark, and we should plan on it. She was right, the way she was always right about water. I liked her a lot. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest. So that's the setup. 7 of us, hand tools, and a chainsaw with maybe 2 tankfuls of gas to its name. Down in a stone box at the dead end of a hollow, building a wall against the dark before a storm. We worked. Building a dry stacked crib wall is slow, and it's heavy. It's the kind of work where you stop thinking about anything except the next rock, where it'll sit, how it'll lock. For a couple of hours, that's all there was. The clink of stone on stone, the saw whining when Dell cut a cedar for the dead men, the creak, and somewhere off down the hollow, that coughing sound. I noticed it first, I think, because it was my first season and I was the kind of nervous that jumps at things. It was a low, wet cough, almost like a throat being cleared, except it came from down the hollow where there shouldn't have been anybody, and it carried. Errol said it was a buck grunting. Then it came again from the other side of the creek, and Errol said there must be 2 bucks. A minute later it came from up behind us, on the slope, and Errol stopped saying anything. Marley said coyotes. Coyotes do yip and carry on down there, but coyotes don't sound like a chest the size of a beer keg working air in and out. We told each other it was coyotes. We kept stacking rock. That is the part I think about the most, honestly. How long we kept stacking rock. Here is the thing about that hollow, the part that mattered later. It is a box. The creek comes in over a low rock crossing at the mouth, runs the length of it, and dead ends against a tall sandstone head wall. At the base of that head wall is a wide undercut, a shelter cave the early people down there used to use. It is big enough to get all of us under, but it has a low, wide mouth you'd have to stoop to enter. Our work site and our whole pile of stone sat right out front of it. The only easy way out on foot is back over that crossing rock at the mouth and up the trail to the rim. There's no climbing out the sides, not without rope and not in the dark. I'm telling you all this because by the time it mattered, every one of us understood the shape of where we were and what it meant. And there was a stretch where nobody said it out loud, because saying it would make it true. Around the time the lights started to flatten out, Sheena went a little ways down the creek to fill the water jugs, and she came back without them. She'd left them on the bank. She said there was a day pack wedged up in a cleft in the head wall, high up, gray and rotted, and a single boot under it. Doyle and I went and looked, because that's the kind of thing you have to look at. It was a hiking pack, the fabric gone the color of old bone, the buckles seized. It was jammed up into a crack about 8 feet off the ground like something had tucked it there. The boot was below it, just one. A left boot, laces still tied. There was no smell to it, no body, nothing else. Doyle stood there a long minute. He said the forest gets the occasional lost hiker. Somebody wanders off the loop and gets turned around, and the agency keeps records of all of it. Search and rescue calls, the works. And he said he had never once heard of a missing person case out of this particular hollow. Not one. Which was strange, he said, because that pack had been up there years. He didn't say anything else about it. We went back to the wall. I didn't think about whose boot it was until much later, and when I did think about it, I wished I hadn't. The first time I felt real fear, the kind that lives in your legs, was when I realized the woods had gone quiet in a specific way. There'd been birds all afternoon, the regular racket of a March woods, and at some point there weren't any. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the creek and us and that cough. And the cough had gotten closer and stopped pretending to be in 3 places. It was just behind the rim of the slope now, above us, moving. Dell felt it too. He'd shut the saw off and he was standing with it dead in his hands, looking up the slope. I have known Dell to stay calm with a hornet on his eyelid, and Dell was not calm. He said quiet, that we ought to pack it in and get to the truck. Doyle looked at the wall, which was maybe 2/3 done, and looked at the sky, and for 1 second I watched him want to finish it. Then a rock the size of a cinder block came down off the slope above us. Not thrown, dislodged, like something big had shifted its weight up there. It cracked into the half-built wall and knocked the top course off, and that ended the argument. We grabbed what we could carry, and we started for the mouth of the hollow, for the crossing rock, for the trail out. And that is when I learned what the coughing had been doing all afternoon. It had been counting us and learning the ground and deciding where it wanted us to go. We didn't get 50 yards. The shapes came down off the slope ahead of us and to the left, between us and the mouth of the hollow. They came low and fast, and there were more than one. I want to be careful here, because everybody wants me to say what they looked like. The honest answer is, I never got a clean, whole look at any of them, not once that whole night, and I think now that was on purpose. Theirs, not mine. What I got was pieces, low to the ground, lower than a person stands, but long and broad through the shoulders and the hips. Heavy, 200 pounds easy, maybe more, built like something that could knock you flat just by leaning into you. Dark, an oily dark, near black, with a shine to it in the bad light. The hair on them was thin and patchy, so you could see the hide underneath, slick and dark. And where the open sky caught their backs, there was a faint dapple, a pattern under the black like rosettes you could only see at the right angle. They moved on all fours, and they were fast that way. But I saw one rear up onto its hind legs at the edge of the creek and stand taller than me for a second. It worked its head side to side, low and wide before it dropped back down. And the smell came with them, which I'll never get rid of. A cold smell, like turned creek mud and wet stone, like the bottom of a spring. Not rot. Cold. There were at least 4 of them that I could count, and probably more I couldn't, and they did not all rush us. That's the thing nobody believes. One came in, fast, straight at the front of our group, and Doyle swung the rock bar at it and it broke off and dropped back. And while we were all looking at that one, another came from the right, from the creek side, and cut behind us. The first cough went up and was answered. And I understood, the way you understand something with your whole body before your head catches up, that they were not trying to kill all of us at once. They were moving us. Every time we pushed toward the mouth of the hollow, a shape would be there, low and broad in the way, coughing, and we'd flinch back. And the only open ground left would be up the hollow, toward the dead end, toward the head wall and our pile of stone. They were spelling each other. One would press and fall back, and another would press from a new side. They never let us get our feet pointed at the crossing rock for more than a second. We were running and stumbling backward up our own work site, past the half-built wall, into the box, right where they wanted us. Janelle was on the creek side. She was the surest of us on her feet, so she'd ended up out on the wing where the ground was worst, on the wet rock by the water. When the shape came from the creek, it came for her. I saw it. I was maybe 20 feet from her, with a come-along still hooked over my shoulder, useless. I saw it come up out of the water margin where it had been low against the dark bank. It hit her at the hips, and she went down on the rock hard, and it had her. The sounds it made were not loud. That's another thing. It was a wet, working, coughing sound, close over her. She was screaming, and the rest of us were up the hollow with the others between us and the water. Here is where I had to decide something, and I want to be honest. For about 2 seconds, I didn't decide anything. I just stood there with a come-along on my shoulder. Then Doyle was already going back down for her, and Dell was right behind him with the saw, and I went too. Because the alternative was to keep climbing toward the head wall while Janelle got pulled into the dark, and I could not do that. I could not have lived after that. So the 3 of us went back down into the open for her, while Marley and Sheena and Errol got to the shelter. I have replayed the next part more times than I can count, and it still comes back in pieces. Dell pulled the saw cord on the way down and got it lit, and that high whine and the smell of 2-stroke smoke did something. The shape over Janelle came off her and gave ground from the noise and the light. Doyle got the rock bar into it, a real hit, into the shoulder. It made a sound I'd never heard a living thing make and broke sideways into the brush. There was a dark, wet streak left on the rock that was its blood, not hers, and that streak is the only reason I ever fully believed they could bleed. I got my hands under Janelle's arms. Her back was open. I'm not going to dress it up. There were long, deep tears across her lower back and her hip down to the muscle. Her left calf was laid open. Her scalp was bleeding into her eyes from where she'd gone down on the rock, or from a claw, I couldn't tell which. She was trying to help me, trying to get her legs under her, and she couldn't. I got her up against me and we went backward up the hollow, the three of us half carrying her. Dell swept that screaming saw side to side behind us. Doyle had the bar, and the shapes paced us in the brush on both sides. Coughing. Never quite committing again, because they'd already gotten what that run was for. They'd gotten one of us hurt, and a hurt one slows the whole group down. I understand that now. I didn't then. Then I just ran backward with my friend's blood soaking through my shirt. We made the shelter cave. We got Janelle under the low mouth of it and into the back, where the rock came down over us and the floor was dry. We put ourselves between her and the open. And for the first time all afternoon, we had a wall at our backs that nothing could come through. And then it got quiet. That's the part of the night I want you to understand. Because the quiet was worse than the running. The shapes pulled back. The coughing moved off down the hollow and got faint. And then there was just the creek and the wind starting to come up ahead of the rain. The six of us were packed into that undercut with Janelle bleeding in the middle of us. And for a while we let ourselves think it was over. We thought they'd gotten what they wanted, taken a swipe and moved on, the way a normal animal might. Errol said it. He said it was probably done, probably moving off to den up before the rain. We wanted to believe him so bad. Sheena had a first aid kit in her pack, and we got Janelle's wounds packed. Folded shirts and the kit's gauze and tape, pressure on the worst of the back. She was conscious and talking low, mostly saying she was cold, asking how bad it was, and we lied to her and said not that bad. Marley had the radio, and she was working it, calling the district, calling anybody. She got nothing but the dead hiss you get at the bottom of a hollow with 200 feet of sandstone between you and the nearest repeater. No bars on the one cell phone anybody had, which in 1996 down there was no surprise to a soul. We were a mile from the truck and a quarter mile below a trail, and we could not tell one single person on Earth where we were. Then we made the decision that I think probably saved us, and I'd love to tell you it was some flash of genius, but it was Janelle, half gone, who said it. She'd been listening to the creek the whole time, even hurt because that's who she was. And she said, real quiet, that the crossing was gone, that the creek had come up with the rain starting, and the crossing rock was underwater now and moving, and nobody was carrying her across that in the dark. And she was right. Doyle had been about to say we should make a run for the truck while the things were off down the hollow. Janelle's read on the water killed that idea. She was right that we'd never get her across, and she was right that the easy way out was closed. So the choice got made for us. We were staying. We were going to ford up in that cave and hold until it was light. In the dark, in that hollow, with the water up and one of us down, there was no way out. Not one that didn't end with the shapes picking us off one at a time in the open. The point where leaving stopped being possible. Where surviving in place became the only plan. I can put my finger on it exactly. It was when the creek went over the crossing rock. So we built a wall. It is the single thing I'm proudest of in my life, and I hope I never have to be proud of anything like it again. The mouth of that shelter cave was low and wide, maybe 4 feet high and 12 feet across. A thing that size would have to come through it, stooped and slow. And we had spent all afternoon hauling flagstone and cut rock down into that hollow for the crib wall. The whole pile of it was staged right there at our feet, in under the head wall, because that's where the broken wall was. So we stacked it. We dragged the staged flagstone and the broken cribstone up across the cave mouth, dry stacked, the same way we'd build a wall on a trail, except faster and meaner. Del laid the cut cedar from the dead men across the top to lock it down. We left one gap, a low notch on the right side, just wide enough for one person to crouch in and hold. You can't seal yourself in completely without losing the ability to see what's coming. I had the rock bar at the gap. Doyle had the saw. And we got a little fire going right at the gap, with a splash of the saw gas over some dry cedar duff and broken branches. Because if there was one thing we'd learned out there in the herding, it was that the light and the smoke gave them pause, made them break off. A fire in the gap was a thing they did not want to come through. I need to be straight with you about that fire, though, and about the saw, because both of them were on a clock. We had 2 tanks of mix and most of one was already gone, and I'd only used a splash to start the fire. A fire that small eats branches faster than 2 scared people can feed it in the dark. We were not safe. We were buying time with things that were running out, and all of us knew it. And we waited for it to come back, because we knew it would. I'll tell you what the waiting was like. It was hours, and I won't pretend I know how many, because I'd lost any sense of time and I wasn't about to look at a watch. The rain came down hard and steady, and the creek roared. Janelle drifted in and out, and we kept her talking, kept her covered, kept pressure on her back. She kept asking about the parking lot, of all things. Kept saying it like a word she could hold on to. The parking lot, the trailhead. Like if she could just get to where the cars were, everything would go back to normal. We took turns at the gap, and turns holding Janelle, and turns just sitting with our backs to the rock, breathing. Somebody, I think it was Marley, kept feeding that little fire one broken stick at a time, just enough to keep it alive, and no bigger than that. Sheena had crackers in her pack and she passed them around. And the strangest thing, we ate them, all of us. Because the body wants what it wants even when the rest of you has gone somewhere else. Errol said, low, that when we got out of this he was going to put in for a desk job in a chair that didn't try to kill anybody. A couple of us actually laughed, the wrong kind of laugh. The kind that comes out of you sideways, and out past the fire the coughing started up again, close, and this time it didn't move off. It worked the dark around the cave mouth. We'd see the firelight catch something low and broad just at the edge of the light, and then it would be gone behind a boulder into the brush. The cough would come from a new place, and another would answer from the other side. They were doing the thing again, the spelling, the taking turns. Except now we had a wall, and they had to figure the wall out. And they were patient about it. That's the word for them. Patient. The first time one came at the wall, it came at the gap, where the fire was, because that was the open place. It came fast and low, and it hit the flagstone stack beside the gap. The whole wall shook and a course of stone came down. I had the bar. I got it into the thing's face or its shoulder, I couldn't see which, and it broke off coughing. We got the stone back up, two-handed, fast, in the firelight, with the rain in our faces. Then it came again from the left side, where there was no gap and no fire, just wall. It got up onto the cedar and started pulling stone off the top. Errol and Marley were up there shoving it back and stacking and shoving. Del hit the saw and ran it at the thing across the top of the wall, and it dropped off. Then we killed the saw again, fast, because of the gas. That was the rhythm of the whole rest of the night. They never all came at once. One would test the gap and fall back, and another would work the wall somewhere else, around and around. A cough handing off to a cough, finding which stone was loose, which of us was tiring. And we were tiring. All of us. Our hands torn up from the stone and the cold, and the wall coming down a little faster each time than we could put it back. The worst of it for me came somewhere in the deepest part of the night, and it's the reason my left hand doesn't close all the way anymore. One of them came at the gap while I was reaching out past the fire to drag a fallen stone back into the notch. I had my arm out past the wall. It came in under the firelight, low, and it got me. A raking hit, down my left forearm and across the back of my hand. Claws or teeth, I still don't know. It had my arm for a second, and it pulled. The only thing that kept it from taking the whole arm, or pulling me out through the gap, was Doyle. He jammed the saw bar into it from the side, and it let go. I went back hard against the rock and cracked my head, and my arm was laid open from the elbow down and pouring. I couldn't grip the bar with that hand anymore. The fingers just wouldn't answer. And for the rest of the night I held the gap one-handed, working the bar in my right and keeping the torn left tucked against my chest. It bled into my shirt next to Janelle's blood that was already there. It hurt in a way I didn't have room to feel until later. At the time, it was just a fact, a thing that had happened to my arm, and I had a gap to hold. That's what fear does near the end of a long enough night. It runs out, and what's left is just tired and stubborn. And then the saw ran dry. Del pulled the cord and it coughed once and quit, out of gas. He set it down quiet. After that, all we had at the wall was the bar and the fire and our hands. I think that was the lowest point, not the arm, the saw going silent and knowing the fire was next. And then, the way it does even when you think it never will, the dark started to thin. I noticed it because I could see the far wall of the hollow as a shape instead of nothing, and because the rain had eased to a drizzle, and because the coughing had gone quieter and the tests at the wall had stopped coming. We held the gap and the wall, and we didn't believe it. We'd believed it was over once already and been wrong. But the gray kept coming up out of the trees, and the creek kept roaring, and nothing came at the wall. And when there was enough light to see the floor of the hollow, I looked out through the gap, and I saw them leave. They didn't run. That's what I can't get past. They came out of the brush and off the slope, unhurried, low and broad and dark in the gray light. There were more of them than I had ever let myself count. They moved back down the hollow toward the mouth in a loose line, in no hurry at all, like a work crew at the end of a shift. The last one stopped at the lip where the slope dropped to the creek. It turned its low, wide head back toward our wall, and it made that cough one more time, soft. And from down the hollow, and from up on the slope, and from across the creek, 3 more answered it. From places we had thought were empty. From places we'd never seen anything all night. And that's when I understood the whole thing. They were never going to come through that wall by force. They didn't need to. They had all night and all the patience in the world, and they were just spelling each other, working us, wearing us down. They were waiting for us to give them the hurt one out in the open, or for one more of us to make a mistake at the gap. They left because the light came. That's the only reason. Not because we beat them. The sun came up, and they didn't want to be in that hollow in the daylight, so they went, on their own schedule. They took nothing with them but the dark streak their own blood had left on the rock where Doyle hit the one with the bar. Mine and Janelle's soaked into the dirt of that cave. When there'd been full daylight for a while, and the coughing was long gone, we tore a hole in our own wall, and we got Janelle out. The creek had dropped enough by then that Doyle and Del could chair carry her across the crossing rock. We went up the trail to the rim and to the truck slow, all of us spent past anything I can describe. Janelle was gray and quiet, and finally, mercifully, not talking about the parking lot anymore. She'd gone quiet the moment the light came, like she'd finally let herself believe we were getting out. We got her to a hospital. She lived. She has scars up her back and a leg that doesn't work right, and she never got on moving water again, which for her was its own kind of loss. But she lived, and so did all 6 of us. And most nights I tell myself that the wall is the reason, and not just the sun coming up when it did. The Forest Service wrote it up as a bear. A problem predator, the report said. A black bear acting aggressive. They closed the back hollow to all use and never said why for long, and that was the end of it as far as anybody official was concerned. I went back to the worksite once, weeks later, when my arm was healed enough, because Doyle asked me to help close it out. The half-built crib wall was still there, and our stacked stone across the cave mouth was still there. And on the boulder by the gap, right where my hand had gripped the rock all night, there was a fresh, greasy, dark smear. Wet. It had not been there in the morning. They'd been marking the rock at the gap right against my hands the whole time. I never heard that part. I found out later, the way you find things out, that there was no record of anyone reporting a missing hiker out of that hollow. Not the pack in the cleft, not the boot, nobody. I carried that one boot out of there that first morning. I don't even remember picking it up. It was just in my good hand when we got to the truck. The gray, rotted left boot with the laces still tied. I put it in the bed, and on the long, slow drive down the forest road, nobody asked me to throw it out. Nobody asked whose it was, and not one of us said a word the whole way down.